Chapter 13 of Jane Austen and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. Jane Austen and Her Times by Geraldine Edith MITTON. Dress and Fashions. Jane Austen had a lively and natural interest in dress, and her letters abound in allusions to fashions, new clothes, and contrivances for bringing into the mode those that had fallen behind it. She cannot have had much chance of seeing new fashions at Steventon, but when she went to a town her instincts revived. During her visit to Bath, 1799, when she was staying with her brother Edward and his wife Elizabeth, and some of their children, she writes, "My cloak has come home. I like it very much, and can now exclaim with delight, like J. Bond at hay harvest, 'This is what I have been looking for these 3 years.' I saw some gauzes in a shop in Bath Street yesterday at only 4d. a yard, but they were not so good or so pretty as mine. Flowers are very much worn, and fruit is still more the thing. Elizabeth has a bunch of strawberries, and I have seen grapes, cherries, plums, and apricots. There are likewise almonds and raisins, French plums, and tamarinds at the grocer's, but I have never seen any of them in hats. A plum or greengage would cost 3 shillings. Cherries and grapes about 5, I believe, but this is at some of the dearest shops." The fashion to which she refers was soon carried to excess. Hannah More in her diary says that she met women who had on their heads an acre and a half of shrubbery, besides slopes, grass plats, tulip beds, clumps of peonies, kitchen gardens, and greenhouses, and she had no doubt that they held in great contempt our roseless heads and leafless necks. Some ladies carry on their heads a large quantity of fruit, and yet they would despise a poor useful member of society who carried it there for the purpose of selling it for bread. This fashion continued to increase until it was mimicked by Garrick, who appeared on the stage with a mass of vegetables on his head, and a large carrot hanging from each side, and ridicule killed the folly. It seems quite certain that fashion, which never reached such grotesque monstrosities as in the lifetime of Jane Austen, hardly touched in its extremer modes herself and her sister, who kept to the simpler styles with good taste. In fact, the jest about the grocers shows that Jane herself saw the humor of the thing, even when living in the very midst of it, a most unusual acuteness. She describes her own hat in the same letter as being a pretty hat, a pretty style of hat too. It is something like Eliza's, only, instead of being all straw, half of it is narrow purple ribbon, which seems simple enough. What one would like to get is some mental picture of Jane as she appeared indoors and out of doors, and this is extremely difficult. In the illustration, "Dressing to Go Out" by Tomkins, we get some idea of everyday fashions. The simple style of a plain material, with perhaps a little spot or sprig upon it, of soft muslin, made with a flowing skirt and a chemisette folded in, and with sleeves reaching only to the elbow, was doubtless the most ordinary kind of indoor dress for women. Add to this a cap, and this is as near as we can get to Jane's usual appearance. The caps, however, varied greatly, being worn both indoors and also for driving. Mr. Austen Leigh remarks that Jane and her sister took to wearing caps earlier in life than was generally the custom, but, on the contrary, caps were worn by very young girls at this period, for Mrs. Papendick says in her journal, which is contemporary, that no young girl of 18 was seen in public without some head covering of this description. We learn many particulars of the different kinds of cap worn by Jane from her own letters. "I have made myself 2 or 3 caps to wear of evenings since I came home, and they save me a world of torment as to hairdressing, which at present gives me no trouble beyond washing and brushing, for my long hair is always plaited up out of sight, and my short hair curls well enough to want no papering. I took the liberty a few days ago of asking your black velvet bonnet to lend me its caul, which it readily did, and by which I have been enabled to give a considerable improvement of dignity to the cap, which was before too nidgety to please me. I still venture to retain the narrow silver round it, put twice round without any bow, and instead of the black military feather shall put in the calico one, as being smarter. And besides, calico is to be all the fashion this winter. After the ball I shall probably make it entirely black. I am not to wear my white satin cap tonight after all. I am to wear a Mameluke cap instead, which Charles Fowle sent to Mary, and which she lends me. It is all the fashion now, worn at the opera, and by Lady Mildmay at Hackwood balls. The word Mameluke was used at this time to describe many articles of dress. It had come into fashion after Nelson's great victory in Egypt, and there were Mameluke cloaks as well as caps. But whether these articles of attire bore the most distant resemblance to those worn in Egypt, or whether the word was tacked on to them merely for the purpose of advertisement, I do not know. Another cap Jane mentions seems to have been much more pert. Miss Hare had some pretty caps, and is to make me one like one of them, only white satin instead of blue. It will be satin and lace, and a little white flower perking out of the left ear, like Harriot Byron's feather. I have allowed her to go as far as £1.16. My cap has come home, and I like it very much. Fanny has one also. Hers is white sarsenet and lace, of a different shape from mine, more fit for morning carriage wear, which is what it is intended for, and is in shape exceedingly like our own satin and lace of last winter, shaped round the face exactly like it, with pipes and more fullness, and a round crown inserted behind. My cap has a peak in front. Large full bows of very narrow ribbon, old twopenny, are the thing, one over the right temple perhaps, and another at the left ear. Some ladies used to hang at the back of their turban-like caps 4 or 5 ostrich feathers of different colours, but apparently a bow or a bit of ribbon sometimes was worn instead of a cap, and supposed to represent it, just as a bit of wire and gauze a few years ago was supposed to be a toque. In one place Jane says, "I wore at the ball your favourite gown, a bit of muslin of the same round my head bordered with Mrs. Cooper's band, and one little comb." The fashion of caps for middle-aged ladies has so recently gone out that it is well remembered, but the fashion of nightcaps, which belongs to a much older generation, seems to us now curious. They were then an essential part of a wardrobe. Henry Bickerseth, afterwards Lord Langdale, writes to his mother in 1800, "I must give you my thanks for the supply of linen you have sent me. It was indeed seasonable, as that which I had before was completely worn out. I am still obliged to solicit some nightcaps." He was then only a boy of 16, and the vision of all the boys in a school going to bed in nightcaps is a funny one. Headdresses reached their climax of absurdity at the end of the 18th century, but the styles varied so much that almost everyone could please themselves. At a famous trial only a few ladies were dressed in the French taste. All the rest, decked in the finest manner with brocades, diamonds, and lace, had no other headdress but a ribband tied to their hair, over which they wore a flat hat, adorned with a variety of ornaments. It requires much observation to be able to give full account of the great effect produced by this hat. It affords the ladies who wear it that arch and roguish air which the winged hat gives to Mercury, and Sir Walter Besant says, "The women wore hoods, small caps, enormous hats, tiny milkmaids' straw hats, hair in curls and flat to the head, pom-poms, or huge structures 2 or 3 feet high, with all kinds of decorations, ribbons, birds' nests, ships, carriages and wagons in gold and silver lace in the erection. Nothing can be conceived so absurd, extravagant, fantastical as the present mode of dressing the head. Simplicity and modesty are things so much exploded, that the very names are no longer remembered. I have just escaped from one of the most fashionable disfigurers, and though I charged him to dress me with the greatest simplicity, and to have only a very distant eye upon the fashion, just enough to avoid the pride of singularity without running into ridiculous excess, yet in spite of all these sage didactics, I absolutely blush at myself and turn to the glass with as much caution as a vain beauty, just risen from the smallpox, which cannot be a more disfiguring disease than the present mode of dressing. H. Moore, 1775. But in 1787 a great change occurred in the mode of hair-dressing. The huge cushions disappeared, and the main part of the hair was gathered together at the back in a chignon, from which one or two loose curls were allowed to escape. The long feathers, which have already been commented on, varied in number from 3 to 1, and continued to be worn well on into the 19th century. These feathers appeared in turbans, bonnets, and headdresses of all kinds, and hardly a picture of the period representing ladies at a card table does not show one or more of these ludicrous, quivering monstrosities. Samuel Rogers says that he had been to Ranelagh in a coach with a lady who was obliged to sit on a stool on the floor of the coach on account of the height of her headdress. Fantastic headgear was not in Jane's line. All the accounts of her hats and bonnets are simple. My mother has ordered a new bonnet, and so have I, both white strip trimmed with white ribbon. I find my straw bonnet looking very much like other people's and quite as smart. Bonnets of cambric muslin are a good deal worn, and some of them are very pretty, but I shall defer one of that sort until your arrival. In the last 10 years of the century, poke bonnets and Dunstable hats were much in evidence, and with flowing curls and flowing ribbons tied in a large bow under the chin, were sometimes not unbecoming to a pretty face. But in Jane's lifetime the strangest fashion that ever caused discomfort to a whole nation gradually died down, that is to say, the use of wigs. Yet that they were worn so late as 1814 is shown by Jane's remark in one of the letters. My brother and Edward, his son, arrived last night. Their business is about teeth and wigs. Nothing quickened the departure of the wig so much as the tax put on hair powder by Pitt in 1785. People argued that they did not mind the money, but they thought it so iniquitous to tax powder that they left off wearing powdered wigs to spite the government. And probably, once having discovered the comfort of doing without these hideous evils, they would never return to them. Yet that the wig, even in its heyday, was not universally worn is shown by the fact that King George III himself refused to wear one. The king's hair, which is very thick and of the finest light color, tied behind with a ribband, and dressed by the hand of the queen, is one of his most striking ornaments. Notwithstanding this, the peruke makers have presented an address to the king, requesting his majesty that, for the good of their body and the nation, he would be pleased to wear a wig. Grosley. No one has given a better account of the wig than Sir Walter Besant. He says, "The wig was a great leveller. With the wig it mattered nothing whether one was bald or not. Again, the wig was a great protection for the head. It saved the wearer from the effects of cold draughts. It was part of the comfort of the age, like the sash window and the wainscoted wall. And the wig, too, like the coat and the waistcoat, was a means of showing the wealth of its owner, because a wig of the best kind, new, properly curled and combed, cost a large sum of money. Practically it was indestructible, and with certain alterations descended. First it was left by will to son or heir. Next it was given to the coachman. Then, with alterations, to the gardener. Then it went to the second-hand people in Monmouth Street, whence it continued a downward course until it finally entered upon its last career of usefulness in the shoeblack's box. There was lastly an excellent reason why in the 18th century it was found more convenient to wear a wig than the natural hair. Those of the lower classes who were not in domestic service wore their own hair. Their heads were filled with vermin. These vermin were very easily caught. Now the man who shaved his head and wore a wig was free of this danger. London in the 18th century. We know that Dr. Johnson's wigs were a constant source of trouble, for they were not only dirty and unkempt, but generally burnt away in the front. For being very near-sighted, he often put his head into the candle when poring over his books. Whenever he was staying with the thralls, therefore, the butler used to waylay him as he passed in to dinner, and pull off the wig on his head, replacing it with a new one. Ladies rarely appeared without headdresses of some kind, be it only a bow or an ornamental comb. They seemed to think that a woman should be seen with her head covered in every place as well as in church. Near the end of Cecilia, the flighty lady Honoria cries, "Why, you know, sir, as to caps and wigs, they are very serious things. For we should look mighty droll figures to go about bareheaded," which shows how entirely custom dictates what appears mighty droll or quite ordinary. Wigs were sometimes the cause of ludicrous incidents, as when in the House of Commons Lord North, suddenly rising from his seat and going out, bore off on the hilt of his sword the wig of Welbore Ellis, who happened to be stooping forward. Many people, when wigs began to go out of fashion, powdered their own hair, and of this Besant gives us also an unpleasant but speaking picture. Among the minor miseries of life is to be mentioned the slipping and sliding of lumps of the powder and pomatum from the head down to the plate at dinner. Even boys at school wore cues. Of a master at Eton it is said that his management of the boys, excellent in other respects, was in some things amiss, for he burnt all their ruffles and cut off their queues. The Times of April 14, 1795, mentions that a numerous club has been formed in Lambeth called the Crop Club, every member of which, on his entrance, is obliged to have his head docked as close as the Duke of Bridgewater's old bay coach horses. This assemblage is instituted for the purpose of opposing, or rather evading, the tax on powdered heads. The use of powder is mentioned in Jane Austen's story, The Watsons, and is one of the very few touches she gives that carry us backward in time. Mrs. Robert Watson is speaking to her sisters-in-law. "I would not make you wait," said she, "so I put on the first thing I met with. I am afraid I am a sad figure. My dear Mr. W., addressing her husband, you have not put any fresh powder in your hair." "No, I do not intend it. I think there is powder enough in my hair for my wife and sisters." "Indeed, you ought to make some alteration in your dress before dinner when you are out visiting, though you do not at home." "Nonsense." Dinner came, and except when Mrs. Robert looked at her husband's head she continued gay and flippant. Later, when Tom Musgrave arrives, Robert Watson, stealing a view of his own head in an opposite glass, said with equal civility, "You cannot be more in dishabille than myself. We got here so late that I had not time even to put a little fresh powder in my hair. The powders used were very various. And now we are upon vanities. What do you think is the reigning mode as to powder? Only turmeric, that coarse dye that stains yellow. It falls out of the hair and stains the skin so that every pretty lady must look as yellow as a crocus, which, I suppose, will come a better compliment than as white as a lily." Mrs. Pappendick. Flour was frequently used for powdering heads, and in 1795 flour was very scarce and enormously valuable. In the same year, when the powder tax was passed, the Privy Council implored all families to abjure puddings and pies, and declared their own intention to have only fish, meat, vegetables, and household bread, made partly of rye. It was recommended that 1 quartern loaf per head per week should be a maximum allowance. The loaf was to be brought on the table for each to help himself, that none be wasted. The king himself had none but household bread on his table. In 1801 the government offered bounties on the importation of all kinds of grain and flour, and passed the Brown Bread Act 1800, forbidding the sale of wheaten bread, or new bread of any kind, as stale bread would go further. Mary Bateson in Social England. The scarcity and dearness of bread is a thing never felt in the present day, when lumps of the best white bread are flung in heaps in the squares and streets of London, and disdained even by tramps and beggars, and when boys in the north country go round with sacks begging bits of bread which they afterwards use for feeding ponies or horses. Many epigrams and bon mots were made on the new powder tax. A tax on dogs had at that time been generally expected. So one wit wrote, "Full many a chance or dire mishap, oft times twixt the lip and the cup is, the tax that should have hung our dogs, excuses them, and falls on puppies." Of the inconveniences attending the use of powder, the following anecdote is an instance. At one of Lady Crewe's dinner parties, Grattan, after talking very delightfully for some time, all at once seemed disconcerted, and sunk into silence. I asked his daughter, who was sitting next to me, the reason of this. "Oh," she replied, "he has just found out that he has come here in his powdering coat." Samuel Rogers, Table Talk. The Act claimed 1 guinea a year from every user of powder, and was calculated to bring in about £400,000 per annum. The royal family, clergymen whose incomes were under £100, subalterns and all below that rank in the army, officers in the navy under the rank of commander, and all below the 2 eldest unmarried daughters of a family, were exempt. Walter Savage Landor was the first of undergraduates at Oxford to do without powder, and was told he would be stoned for a Republican. The regular academic costume, so late as 1799, consisted of knee breeches of any color, and white stockings. The sun of wigs had not even then set. They covered the craniums of nearly all dons and heads of houses. The gentlemen wore their hair tied up behind in a thin loop called a pigtail. Footmen wore their hair tied up behind in a thick loop called a hoop. Sidney, England and the English. In regard to the rest of the costume of ladies, the most noticeable points of the mode were the high waists and long flowing skirts clinging tightly to the figure. This, if not carried to excess, was certainly becoming, but fashion cannot be content with mediocrity. It must be extravagant. Consequently, with very low bodices and very high waists, came very scanty clothing, with an absence of petticoat, a fashion which left very little of the form to the imagination. I do not say that our English belles went to the extent of some of their French sisters, of having their muslin dresses put on damp, and holding them tight to their figures till they dried, so as absolutely to mould them to their form, but their clothes were of the scantiest, and as years succeeded year, this fashion developed, if one can call diminution of clothing development. John Ashton, Old Times. It is difficult to give any consecutive account of fashions extending over such a long period, for they varied as frequently then as they do now. However, here are a few notes. Colico, that is poppy color, was very fashionable. Jane, as we have seen, adopted it. At one time no lady's dress was considered complete without a dash of coquelicot in sash or trimmings. Jane frequently mentions her cloak. This would not be what ladies call a cloak now, but more what would be described as a fichu, or tippet, covering the shoulders and having long ends which fell like a stole in front. Some of the modern fur stoles are in fact made very much on the same pattern. No lady's wardrobe seems to have been complete without at least one black silk cloak of this sort. Dresses were cut low in front, either in V shape or curved, and even in winter this custom was followed. A silk handkerchief was sometimes folded crosswise over the opening, but very generally, though warmly dressed in other respects, a lady had her neck quite uncovered. The short sleeves which went with low necks necessitated the use of long gloves. which reached above the elbow and were tied there with ribbon. The high waists made the bodice of the dress so small that it was of very little consequence, and sometimes was formed merely by a folded bit of material like a fichu. This was covered by that fashionable and characteristic garment, the pelisse. It was not considered proper for very young girls to wear pelisses. They wore cloaks, but the pelisse did not really differ very greatly from the cloak, for it was like a long open coat, fitting closely to the arm, but falling straight in long ends from the armholes, thus leaving the front of the dress exposed in a panel. Later, pelisses became more voluminous and completely covered the dress, fastening in front. Mrs. Pappendick says, "The outdoor equipment in those days, when pelisses and greatcoats of woolen were not worn by girls, was a black cloak of a silk called mode, stiff, glossy, wadded, armholes with a sleeve to the wrist from them, a small muff, and a Quaker-shaped bonnet, all of the same material." Huge muffs were very common, and this is one of the features of the dress of that date which is generally remembered because of its singularity. The small girls were dressed in long skirts plainly made, and their robes must have precluded any possibility of romping. The short skirts and long stockinged legs of our present mode would have made them stare indeed. As for the materials for dresses, they were of course much less varied than the inventions of printing and machinery allow women to use nowadays. Plain muslins, or muslins embroidered at the edge, were most common, though there were other materials such as taffeta, sarsenet, and bombazine. We must realize also that any lace used in trimming must have been real lace. There was no machine-made stuff at 2 3/4 pence a yard, with which every servant girl could deck herself as she does now. India muslins were extremely popular, and seem to have been worn quite regardless of the climate, which according to accounts, our grandmothers notwithstanding, does not seem to have changed remarkably. When Lady Newdigate was at Brighton in 1797, she writes to her husband, "Do ask of your female cronies if they have any wants in the muslin way. Nothing else is worn in gowns by any rank of people, but I don't know that I can get them cheaper here. But great choice there is, very beautiful and real India." In January 1801, Jane writes from Steventon, "I shall want 2 new colored gowns for the summer, for my pink one will not do more than clear me from Steventon. I shall not trouble you, however, to get more than one of them, and that is to be a plain brown cambric muslin for morning wear. The other, which is to be a very pretty yellow and white cloud, I mean to buy in Bath. Buy 2 brown ones, if you please, and both of a length, but one longer than the other. It is for a tall woman. 7 yards for my mother, 7 yards and a half for me, a dark brown, but the kind of brown is left to your own choice, and I had rather they were different, as it will be always something to say, to dispute about, which is the prettiest. They must be cambric muslin." 10 years later, muslins are still fashionable. "I am sorry to tell you that I am getting very extravagant," she was at this time in London, "and spending all my money. And what is worse for you, I have been spending all yours too. For in a linen draper's shop, to which I went for checked muslin, and for which I was obliged to give 7 shillings a yard, I was tempted by a pretty colored muslin and bought 10 yards of it on the chance of your liking it. But, at the same time, if it should not suit you, you must not think yourself at all obliged to take it. It is only 3 and 6 per yard, and I should not in the least mind taking the whole. In texture, it is just what we prefer, but its resemblance to green crewels, I must own is not great, for the pattern is a small red spot." That silly and affected nomenclature for the dress fabrics was in use then as it is still, is apparent from Hannah More's remark. One lady asked what was the newest color. The other answered that the most truly fashionable silk was a sucon de verre, lined with a super étouffé et bradi de l'Esperance, Now you must not consult your old-fashioned dictionary for the word espérance, for you will there find that it means nothing but hope, whereas espérance in the new language of the time means rosebuds. The most particular description of a dress Jane ever gives is almost minute enough to be followed by a dressmaker. It is to be a round gown with a jacket and a frock front, to open at the side. The jacket is all in one with the body, and comes as far as the pocket holes, about half a quarter of a yard deep, I suppose, all the way round, cut off straight at the corners with a broad hem. No fullness appears either in the body or the flap. The back is quite plain, and the side equally so. The front is sloped round to the bosom and drawn in, and there is to be a frill of the same to put on occasionally when all one's handkerchiefs are dirty, which frill must fall back. She is to put 2 breadths and a half in the tail, and no gores not being so much worn as they were. There is nothing new in the sleeves, they are to be plain, with a fullness of the same falling down and gathered up underneath, low in the back behind, and a belt of the same. It is of course most obvious that the ludicrous fashions and enormous erections which were carried by the leaders of fashion did not affect quiet country girls, just as in our own time the distorted sleeves or ever-changing skirts and all the vagaries of the smart set are known and seen by hundreds who daily go about in perfectly simple clothes, which yet cannot be called unfashionable because they conform in main points to the dictates of the fashion of the moment without going to excess. 2 more characteristic quotations from the letters must be given. How do you like your flounce? We have seen only plain flounces. I hope you have not cut off the train of your bombazine. I cannot reconcile myself to giving them up as morning gowns. They are so very sweet by candlelight. I would rather sacrifice my blue one for that purpose. In short, I do not know, and I do not care. And in the following year, I have determined to trim my lilac sarsenet with lilac satin ribbon, just as my chine crape is. 6d width at bottom, 3d or 4d at top. Ribbon trimmings are all the fashion at Bath. With this addition it will be a very useful gown, happy to go anywhere. In one small point the lady of the 18th century resembled her successor of today. The Times of November 9, 1799, notes, "What is still more remarkable is the total abjuration of the female pocket. Every fashionable fair carries her purse in her work-bag, and she has the pleasure of laying everything that belongs to her upon the table wherever she goes." Hoops were worn in court dress long after they were abandoned elsewhere. Someone describes them as the excrescences and balconies with which modern hoydens overwhelm and barricade their persons. Apart from this survival at court, dress was generally long and clinging. At one of the drawing-rooms of 1796, crape was all the fashion. Princess Augusta was dressed in a rich gold-embroidered crape petticoat in leaves across, intersected with blue-painted foil in shaded spots, having the appearance of stripes from top to bottom, ornamented with a rich embroidered border in festoons of blue shaded satin and gold spangles. Pocket holes ornamented with broad gold lace and blue embroidered satin bows, white and gold body and train. There are many other costumes described at the same drawing room, from which we gather that the hair was dressed very full and high, and quite off the ears, and that bandeaus of gold or silver lace, or black velvet embroidered with gold, were run through it. Gold and silver artificial flowers were also very commonly worn, and some ladies had plumes. There were also a few caps. The ladies all wore full-dress neckerchiefs with point lace, sufficiently open to display irresistible charms. Men's dress of the same period was most magnificent, and perhaps the feature of it that would strike one most in contrast with modern fashions would be its variety of color. Coats and waistcoats were always colored. Black was only donned for mourning. Gold and silver lace and figured brocades, with lace cuffs and ruffles, were essential to a beau. Horace Walpole notes at the wedding of a nephew that, except for himself, there wasn't a bit of gold lace anywhere in the dress of the men, and he considered it altogether as a very poor affair. A fairly good idea of the different degrees of plainness and ornament in the clothes worn by gentlemen may be gathered from Reynolds' portrait group of Inigo Jones, Hon. H. Fane, and C. Blair, which was done at this time. The following is the wardrobe of a fashionable man of the time. My wardrobe consisted of 5 fashionable coats full mounted, 2 of which were plain, 1 of cut velvet, 1 trimmed with gold, and another with silver lace, 2 frocks, 1 of which was drab with large plate buttons, the other of blue with gold binding, 1 waistcoat of gold brocade, 1 of blue satin, embroidered with silver, 1 of green silk trimmed with broad figured gold lace, 1 of black silk with fringes, 1 of white satin, 1 of black cloth, and 1 of scarlet, 6 pairs of cloth breeches, 1 pair of crimson, and another of black velvet, 12 pair of white silk stockings, as many of black silk, and the same number of fine cotton, 1 hat laced with gold point d'Espagne, another with silver lace scalloped, a third gold binding, and a 4th plain, 3 dozen of fine ruffled shirts, as many neckcloths, 1 dozen of cambric handkerchiefs, and the like number of silk, a gold watch with a chased case. It was the fashion to wear 2 watches at one time during the century, 2 valuable diamond rings, 2 mourning swords, 1 with a silver handle, and a 4th cut steel inlaid with gold, a diamond stock buckle, and a set of stone buckles for the knees and shoes, a pair of silver-mounted pistols with rich housings, a gold-headed cane, and a snuff-box of tortoise-shell mounted with gold, having the picture of a lady on the top. In the new guide, already quoted, the following account is put into the mouth of a young gentleman of fashion. I ride in a chair with my hands in a muff, and have bought a silk coat and embroidered the cuff. But the weather was cold, and the coat it was thin, so the tailor advised me to line it with skin. But what with my Nivernois hat can compare bagwig and lace ruffles and black solitaire? And what can a man of true fashion denote, like an ell of good ribbon tied under the throat? My buckles and box are in exquisite taste. The one is of paper, the other of paste. Fox, when a very young man, was a prodigious dandy, wearing a little odd French hat, shoes with red heels, and so forth. He and Lord Carlisle once travelled from Paris to Lyons for the express purpose of buying waistcoats, and during the whole journey they talked about nothing else. S. Rogers, Table Talk. Jane Austen's brother Edward would dress, as befitted his position, with greater variety of colour and style than his clergyman father and brother. It was the usual thing for a clergyman to dress in black, with knee breeches and white stock, but it was not essential. In Northanger Abbey, when Henry Tilney is first introduced to Catherine in the lower rooms at Bath, there is nothing in his attire to indicate that he is a clergyman, a fact which she only learns subsequently. In ordinary civilian dress, men wore long green, blue, or brown cloth coats, with stocks and frilled ruffles. In The Man of Feeling, a man casually met with is wearing a brownish coat with a narrow gold edging, and his companion an old green frock with a buff-coloured waistcoat, while an ex-footman, trying to play the gentleman, has on a white frock and a red laced waistcoat. At that time footgear for men consisted of slippers in the house, and riding boots for out of doors. When Beau Nash was forming the assemblies at Bath, as has been said, he made a dead set against the habit some men had of wearing boots in the dancing room. The gentlemen's boots also made a very desperate stand against him. The country squires were by no means submissive to his usurpations, and probably his authority alone would never have carried him through, had he not reinforced it with ridicule. His ridicule took the form of a squib, one verse of which was as follows: "Come trollops and slatterns, cocked hats and white aprons, this best our modesty suits, for why should not we in dress be as free as hogs Norton squires in boots?" The keenness, severity, and particularly the good rhymes of this little morceau, which was at that time highly relished by many of the nobility at Bath, gained him a temporary triumph. But to push his victories he got up a puppet show, in which Punch came in, booted and spurred in the character of a country squire. When told to pull off his boots, he replies, "Why, madam, you may as well bid me pull off my legs. I never go without boots, I never ride, I never dance without them." And this piece of politeness is quite the thing in Bath. We always dance at our town in boots, and the ladies often move minuets in riding boots. From this time few ventured to appear at the assemblies in Bath in riding dress. Life of Nash, 1772. End of Dress and Fashions.
Chapter 14 of Jane Austen and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosalind Walsh, Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. Jane Austen and Her Times by Geraldine Edith MITTON. Chapter 14 at Southampton. For 2.5 years, that is to say, from May 1801 to September 1804, we do not hear any more of Jane Austen from her own correspondence. Then, while she was staying at Lyme, she sent a letter to her sister, which is given in Mr. Austen Leigh's memoir. It will be remembered that part of the scene in Persuasion takes place at Lyme, where the principal characters are transported, and where Louisa Musgrove meets with her accident. Captain Wentworth's friend, Captain Harville, had settled there for the winter, and wrote such a glowing account of the fine country around that the young people were all wild to see Lyme. The party that finally went were the heroine, Anne Elliot herself, her brother and sister-in-law, her two friends, Henrietta and Louisa Musgrove, and her quondam lover, Captain Wentworth, who was at this time paying rather more attention to Louisa Musgrove than could be borne with easiness by poor Anne, who had realized the dreadful mistake she had made in giving him up 7 years before. Quote, "They were come too late in the year for any amusement or variety which Lyme, as a public place, might offer. The rooms were shut up, the lodgers almost gone, scarcely any family but the residents left. And as there is nothing to admire in the buildings themselves, the remarkable situation of the town, the principal street almost hurrying into the water, the walk to the Cobb, skirting round the pleasant little bay, which in the season is animated with bathing machines and company, the Cobb itself, its old wonders and new improvements, with the very beautiful line of cliffs stretching out to the east of the town, are what the stranger's eye will seek, and a very strange stranger it must be, who does not see charms in the immediate environs of Lyme to make him wish to know it better. The scenes in its neighbourhood charmeth, with its high grounds and extensive sweeps of country, and still more its sweet retired bay, backed by dark cliffs, where fragments of low rock among the sands make it the happiest spot for watching the flow of the tide, for sitting in unwearied contemplation. The woody varieties of the cheerful vista of Uplyme, and above all Pinny, with its green chasms between romantic rocks, where the scattered forest trees and orchards of luxuriant growth declare that many a generation must have passed away since the first partial falling of the cliff prepared the ground for such a state, where a scene so wonderful and so lovely is exhibited, as may more than equal any of the resembling scenes of the far-famed Isle of Wight. These places must be visited and visited again to make the worth of Lyme understood." End quote. It is wonderful that Jane should have remembered in such detail a place which she had apparently only seen on one visit, and that many years before she wrote the book in which the description is embodied, but it is not unlikely that, as the instinct of word painting was strong within her, she wrote down some account on the spot, and had it for reference afterwards. Louisa's wilfulness in leaping down the steps of the Cobb, and her subsequent accident, at which Captain Wentworth deceives Anne further as to the real state of his feelings, by displaying much poignant and unnecessary grief, form the chief episode in the book. While at Lyme herself, Jane took part in the usual amusements. She went to a dance, and was escorted back by James and a lanthorn, though I believe the lanthorn was not lit up as the moon was up. She walked on the Cobb and bathed in the morning. Also she looked after the housekeeping for her father and mother, who were with her in lodgings. This was in September. In the beginning of the following year her father died, but there is no letter yet published from which we can judge any of the details or the state of her feelings at this great loss. In the April after this event, there are 2 letters, given by Mr. Austen Leigh, written from Gay Street, Bath, in which no allusion is made to her father's death. She and her mother were then in lodgings. It was at the end of this year that they moved to Southampton. Jane's pen had not been altogether idle while at Bath, for it is supposed that she there wrote the fragment, The Watsons, which is embodied in Mr. Austen Leigh's memoir. It must also have been at this time that the MS. of Northanger Abbey was offered to the Bath bookseller, a transaction which is described elsewhere. Before leaving Bath, Jane went to stay with her brother Edward Knight at Godmersham. This was in August of the same year, 1805. Godmersham, to which the Austen girls so often went on visits, is thus described by Lord Brabourne, who certainly had every right to know. Quote, "Godmersham Park is situated in one of the most beautiful parts of Kent, namely in the valley of the Stour, which lies between Ashford and Canterbury. Soon after you pass the Y station of the railway, from the former to the latter place, you see Godmersham Church on your left hand, and just beyond it comes into view the wall which shuts off the shrubberies and pleasure grounds of the great house from the road. Close to the church nestles the home farm, and beyond it the rectory, with lawn sloping down to the river Stour, which for a distance of nearly a mile runs through the east end of the park. A little beyond the church you see the mansion, between which and the railroad lies the village, divided by the old high road from Ashford to Canterbury, nearly opposite Godmersham. The valley of the Stour makes a break in that ridge of chalk hills, the proper name of which is the backbone of Kent, so that Godmersham Park beyond the house is upon the chalk downs, and on its further side is bounded by King's Wood, a large tract of woodland containing many hundred acres and possessed by several different owners." End quote. The children of Edward and Elizabeth were now growing up. The eldest boy, Edward, was delicate, and there was some talk of taking him to Worthing instead of sending him back to school. However, he apparently grew stronger, for he returned to school again with his brother George. The next 2 boys were Henry and William. Jane says she has been playing battledore and shuttlecock with the younger of the 2. Quote, "He and I have practised together 2 mornings and improve a little. We have frequently kept it up 3 times, and once or twice 6." End quote. The eldest girl, Fanny, had become almost as dear as a sister to her aunt, and the next, Elizabeth, are also mentioned in the letters. There were, besides these younger children, 2 more boys and 3 girls, a fine family. Before coming to Godmersham, Jane had stayed at Eastwell, where George Hatton and his wife, Lady Elizabeth, lived. Their eldest son succeeded later to the title of 9th Earl of Winchelsea. Jane mentions this lad as a fine boy, but was chiefly delighted with his younger brother Daniel, who afterwards married a daughter of the Earl of Warwick. At the time she wrote this letter, Cassandra was at Goodnestone with the Bridges. The two sisters soon after changed places, crossing on the journey, as Jane went to Goodnestone and Cassandra to Godmersham. Owing to the difficulty of carriage transit, journeys must frequently have been arranged thus to save the horses double work. Jane, in writing from Goodnestone, alludes much to the two Bridges girls, Harriet and her delicate sister Mary Ann. There was to be a great ball at Deal, for which Harriet Bridges received a ticket and an invitation to stay at Dover, but this was suddenly put off on account of the death of the Duke of Gloucester, brother of George III. Jane opined that everybody would go into mourning on his account. Mourning was, of course, much more generally used then than now, and everyone seems to have rushed into it whether they belonged to the court or not on the death of any member of the royal family. During the 4 years that had passed since the beginning of the century, Europe had been in a continual turmoil, a turmoil that could never cease while Napoleon was at liberty. The Battle of Alexandria in the first year of the new century had taught him that the English were as formidable on land as on sea, and the Battle of the Baltic in the following month further convinced him that there was one unconquered nation that dared oppose him. He recognized, however, that while he could not but acknowledge the superiority of Britain on the sea, and in places accessible by sea, he could do much as he pleased on the continent. Therefore a compromise was arrived at, and on March 27th, 1802, the Treaty of Amiens was signed, and for the first time for many years the strain of war was relaxed in Great Britain. The arrogance of Napoleon, however, made a continuous peace impossible, and by the spring of the next year, 1803, the two nations were again ready to spring at each other's throats. Napoleon seized and detained 10,000 British travellers who were in France, and this provoked fury in Great Britain. Great preparations were now once more made in France for the long-cherished project of the invasion of England, where in a few weeks 300,000 volunteers were enrolled. The national excitement was tremendous, and Jane must have heard at least as much about the preparations for war and the dangers of invasion, even in the frivolous society of Bath, as about dress and trivial society details. In May 1804, Napoleon threw aside all disguise and had himself proclaimed Emperor of the French, and by the end of the same year Spain, having thrown in her lot with France, declared war also against England. The whole of 1805 must have been one of tense excitement to every one with a brain to understand. The future of England trembled in the balance, yet Jane's pleasant letters from Godmersham deal in nothing but domestic detail and small talk. Not one allusion is there to the throes which threatened to rend the national existence. In the autumn of 1805, both the sisters had returned to their mother, who in their absence had had the companionship of Martha Lloyd. Then came the removal to Southampton, where they went to quote, "a commodious old-fashioned house in a corner of Castle Square." End quote. Mr. Austen Leigh, writing from recollection, says, quote, "My grandmother's house had a pleasant garden bounded on one side by the old city walls. The top of this wall was sufficiently wide to afford a pleasant walk with an extensive view, easily accessible to ladies by steps. At that time Castle Square was occupied by a fantastic edifice, too large for the space in which it stood, though too small to accord well with its castellated style, erected by the second Marquess of Lansdowne, half-brother to the well-known statesman who succeeded him in the title. The Marchioness had a light phaeton drawn by 6 and sometimes by 8 little ponies, each pair decreasing in size and becoming lighter in colour. It was a delight to me to look down from the window and see this fairy equipage put together, for the premises of the castle were so contracted that the whole process went on in the little space that remained of the open square. On the death of the Marquess in 1809, the castle was pulled down. Few probably remember its existence, and anyone who might visit the place now would wonder how it ever could have stood there." End quote. Mrs. Austen was not well off, for her husband had had no private means, and she herself but little. Yet her son Edward was well able to help her, for Chawton alone is said to have been worth £5,000 a year. There was also money in the family, for Jane some years later speaks of her eldest brother's income being £1,100 a year. She and her sister must have had some little allowance also, as it was with her own money that she paid for the publication of the first of her books. Simply as she had always lived, she does not seem to have had small ideas on the subject. The couples in her books require about £2,000 a year before they can be considered prosperous, and incomes of from £5,000 to £10,000 are not rare. She makes one of the characters in Mansfield Park remark, on hearing that Mr. Crawford has £4,000 a year, quote, "Those who have not more must be satisfied with what they have. £4,000 a year is a pretty estate." End quote. There was apparently some question raised by her relations about the income bestowed by Jane upon the mother and daughters in Sense and Sensibility, namely £500 a year. But having regard to all the circumstances, the style to which they were accustomed, and Mrs. Dashwood's inability to economize, this could perhaps hardly have been made less. We hear at the close of one year at Southampton that Mrs. Austen is pleased, quote, "at the comfortable state of her own finances, which she finds on closing her year's accounts, beyond her expectation as she begins the new year with a balance of £30 in her favour." End quote. And afterwards, quote, "My mother is afraid I have not been explicit enough on the subject of her wealth. She began 1806 with £68. She begins 1807 with £99, and this after £32 purchase of stock." End quote. In this year, 1805, the income tax was increased from 6.5% to 10%, on account of the tremendous war expenditure. At this time an amicable arrangement had been arrived at, by which Frank Austen and his wife shared the house of the mother and sisters at Southampton, Frank himself being of course frequently away. His first wife, Mary Gibson, whom he had only recently married, lived until 1823, and is referred to by her sister-in-law as Mrs. F.A., doubtless to distinguish her from the other Mary, James' wife. Martha Lloyd, whom Frank married as his second wife, long after, seems to have been such a favourite with the family that she practically lived with the Austens at Southampton, as her own mother had died some years before. The country round Southampton is pretty, and the town itself pleasant. We have a contemporary description of it in 1792. Quote, "Southampton is one of the most neat and pleasant towns I ever saw. Was once walled round, many large stones of which are now remaining. There were 4 gates, only 3 now. It consists chiefly of one long fine street of 3/4 of a mile in length, called the High Street. The Polygon, not far distant, could the original plan have been completed, 'tis said would have been one of the first places in the kingdom. At the extremity a capital building was erected with 2 detached wings and colonnades. The centre was an elegant tavern, with assembly, card-rooms, etc., and at each wing hotels to accommodate the nobility and gentry. The tavern is taken down, but the wings converted into genteel houses." End quote. Mrs. Libby Powys. There does not seem to be any record of the first year spent here. There are no letters preserved, and we know that Jane wrote no more novels. Household affairs and altering clothes according to the mode must have filled up days too pleasantly monotonous to have anything worth recording. Southampton evidently did not inspire her, for it figures in none of her books, though its neighbour Portsmouth is described as the home of Fanny Price in Mansfield Park. Yet in October 1805, just at the time Jane was settling into her new home, was fought the Battle of Trafalgar, which smashed the allied fleets of Spain and France, and freed Britain from any fear of invasion. As it was a naval battle, we can imagine for the sake of her brothers, she must have thrilled at the tremendous news, which would arrive as fast as a sailing ship could bring it, probably a day or two after the action. In January 1807, Cassandra was again at Godmersham, and Jane writes her several letters full of family detail as usual. James Austen had then been staying at Southampton with his wife. Perhaps they had brought with them the little son who looked out of the window at the fairy carriage and the ponies. As he was born in November 1798, he would be between 8 and 9 years old. His little sister Caroline certainly was there, for she is mentioned by name. In speaking of a book, Jane draws a distinction between her two sisters-in-law. Quote, "Mrs. F.A., to whom it is new, enjoys it as one could wish. The other Mary, I believe, has little pleasure from that or any other book." End quote. The garden at Southampton was evidently the cause of much enjoyment. Quote, "We hear that we are envied our house by many people, and that our garden is the best in the town. Our garden is putting in good order by a man who bears a remarkably good character, has a very fine complexion, and asks something less than the first. The shrubs which border the gravel walk, he says, are only sweet briar and roses, and the latter of an indifferent sort. We mean to get a few of a better kind, therefore, and at my own particular desire he procures us some syringas." I could not do without a syringa, for the sake of Cowper's lime. We talk also of laburnum. The border under the terrace wall is clearing away to receive currants and gooseberry bushes, and a spot is found very proper for raspberries." End quote. In this extract, the odd use of the active for the passive tense, in fashion in the 18th century, jars on modern ears. These and similar constructions, used throughout the novels, have had something to do with the opinions of those people who have dismissed these brilliant works as vulgar. Terrific fighting continued on the continent, and in December the prestige of Napoleon was enhanced on the stubborn field of Austerlitz. In the beginning of 1806, England had the misfortune to lose by death the great minister Pitt, who had steered her through such perilous times. It is said that the news of Austerlitz was the final blow to a nature worn out by stress and anxiety. In September of the same year, his talented but inferior rival, Fox, died also. In this year was issued the famous Berlin Decree, by which Napoleon prohibited all commerce with Great Britain, and declared confiscated any British merchandise or shipping. But Britain had spirit enough to retort in the following year with a decree declaring a blockade of France, and that any of her merchant vessels were fair prizes unless they had previously touched at a British port. The war continued without intermission throughout 1807. Austria, exhausted, had sullenly withdrawn. Prussia had plucked up spirit to join with Russia in opposing the conqueror of Europe. But in June, after the hard-fought battle of Friedland, France concluded with Russia the secret peace of Tilsit, based upon mutual hatred of England. England, however, soon found out the menace directed against her, and as the French troops marched to Denmark, evidently with the intention of summoning that country to use her fleet in accordance with their orders, England, by a prompt and brilliant countermove, appeared before Copenhagen first, and by bombarding the town compelled submission, and carried away the whole fleet for safety's sake. Those were glorious days for the navy, when measures were prompt and decisive, when no hesitation and shilly-shallying and fear of hurting the feelings of an unscrupulous enemy prevented Britain from taking care of herself. Britain was now at war with Russia and Denmark as well as France, but the unprecedented duplicity of Napoleon in Spain in 1807 gave Britain an unexpected field on which to do battle, and allies by no means to be despised. Spain was France's ally, yet France, after marching through the country to crush Portugal, quietly annexed the country of their ally in returning, and by a ruse made the whole royal family prisoners in France, while Napoleon's brother Joseph, King of Naples, was subsequently proclaimed king. The Spaniards were aroused, and though the best of their troops had been previously drawn off into Germany by the tyrant, they managed to give a good account of themselves, even against the invincible French. Joseph Bonaparte had been proclaimed King of Spain in June 1808. In that month Jane was at Godmersham again, and though she did not know it, this was the last visit she would pay before the death of Mrs. Edward Knight, which occurred in the following October, at the birth of her 11th child. Jane seems to have noticed her sister-in-law was not in good health. She says, quote, "I cannot praise Elizabeth's looks, but they are probably affected by a cold." End quote. Mr. and Mrs. James Austen accompanied her on this visit, and her account of the arrival gives such a homely picture that, trivial as it is worth quoting. Quote, "Our two brothers were walking before the house as we approached, as natural as life. Fanny and Lizzie met us in the hall with a great deal of pleasant joy. Fanny came to me as soon as she had seen her Aunt James to her room, and stayed while I dressed. She has grown both in height and size since last year, but not immoderately, looks very well, and seems, as to conduct and manner, just what she was and what one could wish her to continue. Yesterday passed quite à la Godmersham. The gentleman rode about Edward's farm, and returned in time to saunter along Bentigh with us, and after dinner we visited the Temple plantations. James and Mary are much struck with the beauty of the place." End quote. Lord Brabourne gives a note on the Temple plantation. It was, quote, "once a ploughed field, but when my grandfather first came to Godmersham, he planted it with underwood, and made gravel walks through it, planted an avenue of trees on each side of the principal walk, and added it to the shrubberies. The family always walked through it on their way to church, leaving the shrubberies by a little door in the wall at the end of the private grounds." End quote. The casual sentence, quote, "Mary finds the children less troublesome than she expected," end quote, adds one more stroke to the character of that sister-in-law which Jane makes us know so well. Mrs. Knight Sr. was still living, and was generous toward the other members of her adopted son's family besides himself. Quote, "This morning brought me a letter from Mrs. Knight, containing the usual fee and all the usual kindness. She asks me to spend a day or two with her this week. Her very agreeable present will make my circumstances quite easy. I shall reserve half for my pelisse." End quote. It will be remembered that Mrs. Edward Knight had been a Miss Bridges, and the good-natured Harriet, her sister, was now staying at Godmersham with her own husband, Mr. Moore, whom Jane did not think good enough for her, though she admits later, quote, "he is a sensible man and tells a story well." End quote. She refers to her sister-in-law's opinion of her, quote, "Mary was very disappointed in her beauty, and thought him very disagreeable. James admires her, and finds him pleasant and conversable." End quote. It was at the conclusion of this visit that Jane wrote to her sister of the pressing necessity of coming home again to meet the visitor with whom her "honour as well as affection," were engaged. She was now 32, no longer a young girl, and not at all likely to mistake the nature of attentions of which she had had her full share. However it was, whether the visitor did not come, or coming proved himself unequal to her ideal, we do not know. And in any case, the romance so mysteriously suggested by these few words must ever remain in the shadow. Jane speaks with pleasure of her sister-in-law Elizabeth, "having a very sweet scheme of accompanying Edward into Kent next Christmas." Alas, before that Christmas came, the loving mother, who seems to have been in every way a perfect wife and sister, was no more. When this sad event occurred in October, the sisters had changed places, Cassandra being at Godmersham and Jane at Southampton. The first of Jane's letters of this period is congratulatory on the birth of Edward's 11th child and 6th son, but very shortly afterwards she writes in real sorrow at the dreadful news which has reached her of the death of her dear sister-in-law. The news came by way of Mrs. James Austen and her sister Martha, who was at Southampton. "We have felt, we do feel, for you all, as you do not need to be told, for you, for Fanny, for Henry, for Lady Bridges, and for dearest Edward, whose loss and whose sufferings seem to make those of every other person nothing. God be praised that you can say what you do of him, that he has a religious mind to bear him up, and a disposition that will gradually lead him to comfort. My dear, dear Fanny, I am so thankful that she has you with her. You will be everything to her. You will give her all the consolation that human aid can give. May the Almighty sustain you all, and keep you, my dearest Cassandra, well. With that true sympathy our feelings are shared by Martha, you need not be told, she is the friend and sister under every circumstance." Poor Fanny was then in her 16th year, the time when a girl perhaps feels the loss of a sensible, affectionate mother more than any other. She acquitted herself splendidly in the difficult task that fell on her as the eldest of so many brothers and sisters. Her next sister, Lizzie, was at this time only 8 years old, and though she seems to have felt the loss keenly, it could not be the same to her as it was to Fanny. Mourning at that time entailed heavy crape, and Jane at once fitted herself out with all that was proper. The two eldest boys, Edward and George, were by this time at Winchester College, but when their mother died, they went first to their aunt and uncle at Steventon, and on October 24th came on to Southampton. Jane's next letter is full of them. "They behave extremely well in every respect, showing quite as much feeling as one wishes to see, and on every occasion speaking of their father with the liveliest affection. His letter was read over by each of them yesterday, and with many tears. George sobbed aloud. Edward's tears do not flow so easily, but as far as I can judge, they are both very properly impressed by what has happened. George is almost a new acquaintance to me, and I find him, in a different way, as engaging as Edward. We do not want amusement, bibliocatch, at which George is indefatigable, spillikins, paper ships, riddles, conundrums, and cards, with watching the ebb and flow of the river, and now and then a stroll out, keep us well employed." Rhymed charades were a very common form of amusement at that date, and all the Austen family excelled in them. It will be remembered that Mr. Elton's charade, of which the meaning was courtship, further misled the matchmaking Emma into thinking he was in love with Harriet, the dowerless, while she herself, the heiress, was the real object of his attentions. Several charades of this type, made up by the Austens, are still extant. The two following are Jane's own. "Divided, I'm a gentleman in public deeds and powers. United, I'm a monster who that gentleman devours." To which the answer is a gent. "You may lie on my first, by the side of a stream, and my second composed to the nymph you adore. But if, when you've none of my whole, her esteem and affection diminish, think of her no more," end quote, which is easily read as banknote. Both of these specimens show the gaiety of spirit so noticeable in the smallest extracts from her letters. Her observations on her nephews put the two boys before us to the life. Quote, "While I write now, George is most industriously making and manning paper ships, at which he afterwards shoots horse-chestnuts, brought from Steventon on purpose, and Edward equally intent over the lake of Killarney, and twisting himself about in one of our great chairs." End quote. Her wonderful powers as an entertainer are clearly shown in this sad time, when she strove to keep her nephews occupied to the exclusion of sad thoughts. She took them for excursions on the Itchen, when they rowed her in a boat, and she was never weary of entering into their sports and feelings. Her real unselfishness came out very strongly on this occasion. Sir Arthur Wellesley had sailed for Spain in the July of this year, and now England was in the throes of the Peninsular War. Some of the very few allusions that Jane ever makes to contemporary events are to be found in reference to the Peninsular War, and these are more personal than general. On hearing of Sir John Moore's death in January 1809, she writes, quote, "I am sorry to find that Sir J. Moore has a mother living, but though a very heroic son, he might not be a very necessary one to her happiness. I wish Sir John had united something of the Christian with the hero in his death. Thank heaven we have had no one to care for particularly among the troops, no one in fact nearer to us than Sir John himself." End quote. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Jane Austen and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tomas Peter. Jane Austen and Her Times by Geraldine Edith MITTON. Chapter 15. Chawton. In 1809 another move was contemplated. Edward Knight had found it in his power to offer his mother and sister a home rent-free, and he gave them the choice of a house in Kent, probably not far from Godmersham, or a cottage at Chawton close to his manor house there. The latter offer was accepted, and preparations were made to alter the cottage, which had been a steward's residence, into a comfortable dwelling. The cottage is still standing, close by the main road, and may be seen by anyone in passing. It is of considerable size, and there are 6 bedrooms besides garrets. It stands close to the junction of 2 roads, one of which passes through Winchester to Southampton, and the other through Fareham to Gosport. Chawton lies about as far northwest of Winchester as Steventon does north. The considerable country town of Alton, which would be convenient for shopping, is only about a mile from the village. The cottage, dreary and weather-beaten in appearance, is of a solid square shape, and abuts on the high road with only a paling in front. It is not an attractive-looking dwelling, but probably at the time was fresher and brighter in appearance than it is now. It had also the advantage of a good garden. It is now partially used for a club or reading room, and partially by cottagers. At the junction of the 2 roads aforesaid is a muddy pond, that which was playfully referred to by Jane in writing to her nephew, who had not been well, when she says, "You may be ordered to a house by the sea, or by a very considerable pond." A short distance along the Gosport road is the entrance gate to the manor house, and about 50 yards up the drive is the pretty little church, considerably altered since Jane's time, with pinnacled and ivy-mantled tower. Just above it is the fine old Elizabethan house. In 1525 one William Knight had a lease of the place. The house itself was probably built by his son John, who bought the estate, and it has remained ever since in the hands of the Knight family, if we may count adoption as ranking in family inheritance. The move to Chawton was evidently some time in contemplation before actually taking place, for writing in December 1808, Jane says that they want to be settled at Chawton, in time for Henry to come to us for some shooting in October at least, or a little earlier, and Edward may visit us after taking his boys back to Winchester. Suppose we name the 4th of September. Of the actual settling in at Chawton we have no details, for the next batch of letters begins in April 1811, and Jane, with her mother and sister, had been there about a year and a half. Chawton was her home for the rest of her short life, though she actually died at Winchester. At Chawton her 3 last novels were written, as will be recounted in detail. It is curious that the periods of her literary activity seem to have been synchronous with her residence in the country. At Steventon and at Chawton, respectively, she produced 3 novels. At Bath only a fragment, and at Southampton nothing at all. The life at Chawton during this and the next few years must have been part of the happiest time she ever experienced. Her first book, Sense and Sensibility, was published in 1811. She had tasted the joys of earning money, and, what was much greater, the joy of seeing her own ideas and characters in tangible shape. She lived in a comfortable, pretty home, with the comings and goings of her relatives at the manor house to add variety, and she had probably lost the restlessness of girlhood. If the conjecture of which we have spoken in a previous chapter was true, she had now had time to get over a sorrow which must have taken its place with those sweet, unrealized dreams in which the pain is much softened by retrospect. That she fully appreciated her country surroundings is shown by frequent notes on the garden at Chawton. Our young peony at the foot of the fir tree has just blown and looks very handsome, and the whole of the shrubbery border will soon be very gay with pinks and sweet williams, in addition to the columbines already in bloom. The syringas, too, are coming out. We are likely to have a great crop of Orleans plums, but not many greengages. You cannot imagine what a nice walk we have round the orchard. The row of beech look very pretty, and so does the young quickset hedge in the garden. I hear today that an apricot has been detected on one of the trees. Yesterday I had the agreeable surprise of finding several scarlet strawberries quite ripe. There are more strawberries and fewer currants than I thought at first. We must buy currants for our wine. Thus the seasons are marked. The Austens ate their own tender young peas from the garden, and my mother's chickens supplied the table. Mrs. Austen at this time seems to have taken a new lease of life. She busied herself with garden and poultry, and did not shirk even the harder details necessitated by these occupations. Her granddaughter Anna, James's eldest daughter, now grown up, was a constant visitor at the cottage, and speaks of Mrs. Austen's wearing a round green frock like a day labourer, and digging her own potatoes. Anna enjoyed the little gaieties that fell to her lot as freshly as her aunt had done at her age, and did with even more simplicity, for Jane remarks of one ball to which she went, "It would not have satisfied me at her age." And again, Anna had a delightful evening at the Miss Middletons, syllabub tea, coffee, singing, dancing, a hot supper, 11 o'clock, everything that can be imagined agreeable, as if the freshness of Anna's youth were very fresh indeed. The beautiful park stretching around Chawton House, with its fine beech trees, was of course quite open to the inhabitants of the cottage, who must have derived many advantages from their near relationship to the owner. Altogether, with the freedom from care for the future, the companionship of her sister, the increased health and energy of her mother, the solace of her writing, the comings and goings of the Chawton party, and the occasional visits to London and elsewhere, to give her fresh ideas, Jane's life must have been as pleasant as external circumstances could make it. We can picture her sauntering out in the early summer sunshine, her head demurely encased in the inevitable cap, while a long stray curl tickles her cheek as she stoops to see the buds bursting into bloom, or triumphantly gathers the earliest rose. We can picture her standing about watching Mrs. Austen feeding the chickens, and giving her opinion as to their management, then going into the little parlour or living-room, and sitting down to the piano while Cassandra manipulated an old-fashioned tambour frame. In this little parlour, in spite of frequent interruptions, Jane did all her writing sitting at the big heavy mahogany desk of the old style, like a wooden box, which opened at a slant so as to form a support for the paper. At this time she was revising Sense and Sensibility for the press, or adding something to the growing pile of manuscript called Mansfield Park. We cannot imagine that she wrote much at a time, for her work is minute, small, and well digested. Probably after a scene or conversation between two of the characters, she would be interrupted by another member of the household, and stroll up to the manor house to give orders for the reception of some of the Knight family, or go into Alton to buy some necessary household article. Occasionally a post-chaise would rattle past, or the daily coach and wagons would form a diversion. For 6 months, during the year 1813, the whole of the Godmersham party lived at Chawton, where their other house was being repaired and painted, and this intercourse added greatly to Jane's happiness. She cemented that affectionate friendship with her eldest niece Fanny, and Lord Brabourne gives little extracts from his mother's diary to show how close a companionship was between the two. Aunt Jane and I had a very interesting conversation. Aunt Jane and I had a very delicious morning together. Aunt Jane and I walked into Alton together, and so on. But during these years there was no abatement of the fierce turmoil in Europe, the Peninsular War, demanding ever fresh levies of men and fresh subsidies of money, was a continual drain on England's resources, and the beginning of 1812 found the French practically masters of Spain. But in that year the tide turned, and after continual and bloody battles and sieges in which the loss of life was enormous, Wellington drove the French back across the Pyrenees, and in the following year planted his victorious standard actually on French soil. But the effects of the continuous wars were being felt in England. In 1811 broke out the Luddite riots, nominally against the introduction of machinery, but in reality because of the high price of bread and the scarcity of employment and money. Austria had signed the disastrous Peace of Vienna with France in 1809, and during this and the following years the continent with small exception was ground beneath the heel of Napoleon, who in 1812 commenced the invasion of Russia, which was to cost him so dearly. In 1811 there is rather a characteristic exclamation in one of Jane's letters apropos of the war. "How horrible it is to have so many people killed, and what a blessing that one cares for none of them!" Napoleon's tyranny and utter regardlessness of the feelings of national pride in the countries he had conquered now began to bring forth for him a bitter harvest. The sixth coalition of nations was formed against him, including Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, and Sweden. After terrific fighting his armies were forced back over the Rhine, and the mighty empire he had formed of powerless and degraded republics melted away like snow in an August sun. In March 1814, Paris itself was forced to surrender to the triumphant armies of the Allies. In April, Napoleon signed his abdication and retired to Elba. Ever since he first appeared as an active agent on the battlefields of Europe, he had kept the continent in a perpetual ferment. Cruelty, bloodshed, and horror had followed in his train. His mighty personality had seemed scarcely human, and his very name struck terror into all hearts, and became a bugbear with which to frighten children. We have 2 letters of Jane's in the early part of March, written from London where she was staying with her brother Henry. There is not another until June, and that is dated from Chawton. Of course it is difficult to imagine that any intermediate letters she wrote can have been entirely free from allusion to the great news at which the whole continent burst into paeans of thankfulness, and which must have made England feel as if she had awakened from a nightmare, but as we have no proof either way it must be left open to doubt. In the June letter she says to Cassandra, who is in London, "Take care of yourself, and do not be trampled to death in running after the Emperor. The report in Alton yesterday was that they would certainly travel this road either to or from Portsmouth." This referred to the visit of the Allied monarchs to England after their triumph in Paris, and the Emperor was the Emperor Alexander of Russia, who but a few years ago had formed a secret treaty with Napoleon to the detriment of England. Here we must leave political matters, to take a short review of the work which Jane had produced in the years since she had come to Chawton. In 1811 the first of her books, Sense and Sensibility, was published at her own expense, and produced in 3 neat little volumes in clear type by T. Egerton, Whitehall. Her identity was not disclosed by the title page, which simply bore the words, "By a Lady." She paid a visit to her brother Henry in London in order to arrange the details, with which Henry helped her very much. When in London with this object, she writes, "No, indeed, I am never too busy to think of Sense and Sensibility. I can no more forget it than a mother can forget her sucking child, and I am much obliged to you for your enquiries. I have had 2 sheets to correct, but the last only brings us to Willoughby's first appearance. Mrs. K. regrets in the most flattering manner that she must wait till May, but I have scarcely a hope of its being out in June. Henry does not neglect it. He has hurried the printer, and says he will see him again to-day. Sense and Sensibility did not come out until she had returned to the country, and when she received £150 for it later on, she thought it a prodigious recompense for that which had cost her nothing. And certainly, considering her anonymity and the small chances the book had, she had good reason to be satisfied. The gratifying reception of Sense and Sensibility seems to have awakened the powers of writing, which had so long lain dormant from want of encouragement. In 1812 she began Mansfield Park, perhaps in some ways the least interesting, though by no means the least well-constructed of her novels. Edmund and Fanny are both a little too mild for the taste of most people, and are far from taking their real place as hero and heroine. However, Edmund's blind partiality for Miss Crawford is very natural, and as Henry Austen himself said, it is certainly impossible to tell until quite the end how the story is going to be finished. The minor characters are throughout excellent. It is one of Jane's shining qualities that no character, however small the part it has to play, remains unknown. She seems able to describe in a touch or two some human quality or defect which at once brings us into intimate relations with either man or woman. Mr. Rushworth's self-importance. "I am to be Count Castle, and to come in first in a blue dress and a pink satin cloak, and afterwards have another fine fancy suit by way of a shooting dress. I do not know how I should like it. I should hardly know myself in a blue dress and pink satin cloak," is excellent. Lady Bertram's character might be gathered from one sentence in the letter which she sends to Fanny telling of her elder son's dangerous illness. "Edmund kindly proposes attending his brother immediately, but I am happy to add Sir Thomas will not leave me on this distressing occasion, as it would be too trying for me." Mrs. Norris, with her sycophantic speeches towards her well-to-do nieces, her own opinion of her virtues, her admonitions to Fanny, her habit of taking credit for the generous acts performed by other people, her sponging, and trick of getting everything at the expense of others, is the most striking figure in the book. When poor Fanny, having been neglected and left alone all day, the odd one of the party, is returning with the rest rather drearily from Rushworth Park, Mrs. Norris remarks, "Well, Fanny, this has been a fine day for you, upon my word. Nothing but pleasure from beginning to end. I'm sure you ought to be very much obliged to your Aunt Bertram and me for contriving to let you go. A pretty good day's amusement you have had." This, when she has done her best to stop Fanny's going at all, depicts her character in unmistakable colours. On another occasion she tells the meek Fanny, "The nonsense and folly of people stepping out of their rank and trying to appear above themselves makes me think it right to give you a hint, Fanny, now that you are going into company without any of us, and I do beseech and entreat you not to be putting yourself forward, and talking and giving your opinion as if you were one of your cousins, as if you were dear Mrs. Rushworth or Julia. That will never do, believe me. Remember, wherever you are, you must be the lowest and last." In the same book, Sir Thomas Bertram's conference with his niece on the proposals he has received for her from Mr. Crawford is a wonderful commentary on the opinions of the time, but is too long to quote in entirety. That Fanny should refuse a handsome, eligible young man, merely because she could neither respect nor love him, was quite incredible, and not only foolish, but wicked. Sir Thomas speaks sternly of his disappointment in her character. "I had thought you peculiarly free from wilfulness of temper, self-conceit, and every tendency to that independence of spirit which prevails so much in modern days, even in young women, and which in young women is offensive and disgusting beyond all common offence." We know what Jane herself thought of coercion of this kind, and how fully her sentiments were on the side of liberty of choice. Among the other excellencies of Mansfield Park we may note the sketch of Fanny's home at Portsmouth, with her loud-voiced father and noisy brothers so distressing to her excessive sensitiveness. With all these merits, and add to them that of excellent construction, Mansfield Park may rank high in spite of its somewhat colourless hero and heroine. We cannot, however, leave Edmund and Fanny in the same certainty of a happy future as we may leave others of the heroes and heroines in the novels. They may rub along well enough, but we feel they cannot but be intolerably dull, though perhaps so long as people are not aware of their own dullness they may enjoy happiness of a negative sort. Henry Austen read Mansfield Park in manuscript while travelling with his sister, and she notes with pleasure, Henry's approbation is hitherto even equal to my wishes. He says it is different from the other two, but he does not think it at all inferior. He has only married Mrs. Rushworth. I am afraid he has gone through the most entertaining part. He took to Lady Bertram and Mrs. Norris most kindly, and gives great praise to the drawing of all the characters. He understands them all, likes Fanny, and, I think, foresees how it will all be. And she adds later, Henry is going on with Mansfield Park. He admires H. Crawford. I mean properly, as a clever, pleasant man. I tell you all the good I can, and I know how much he will enjoy it. Henry has his moments that he likes my M.P. better and better. He is in the 3rd volume. I believe now he has changed his mind as to foreseeing the end. He said yesterday at least he defied anybody to say whether H.C. would be reformed, or forget Fanny in a fortnight. The first 2 extracts are from a letter given in Mr. Austen Leigh's memoir. In 1813 came the publication of Pride and Prejudice, apparently at Mr. Egerton's risk. This was evidently Jane's own favourite among the novels, and her references to it are made with genuine delight. Lady Robert is delighted with P&P, and really was so, I understand, before she knew who wrote it, for of course she knows now. I long to have you hear Mr. H.'s opinion of P&P. His admiring my Elizabeth so much is particularly welcome to me. Poor Dr. Isham is obliged to admire P&P, and to send me word that he is sure he shall not like Madame D'Arblay's new novel half so well. Mrs. C. invented it all, of course. The book had come out quite in the beginning of the year, for in a letter dated January 29th, 1813, given by Mr. Austen Leigh, she writes, I hope you received my little parcel by J. Bond on Wednesday evening, my dear Cassandra, and that you will be ready to hear from me again on Sunday, for I feel that I must write to you today. I want to tell you that I have got my own darling child from London. On Wednesday I received 1 copy sent down by Faulkner with 3 lines from Henry to say that he had given another to Charles and sent a 3rd by the coach to Gormasham. The advertisement is in our paper today for the first time. 18 shillings. You shall ask £1 1 shilling for my 2 next, and £1 8 shillings for my stupidest of all. Mansfield Park was finished in the same year, and came out under the auspices of Mr. Egerton in 1814, though the 2nd edition was transferred to Mr. Murray. Before the publication of Emma, Jane had begun to be known in spite of the anonymity of her title pages. The only bit of public recognition she ever personally received was accorded to her while she was in London, and must be told in the account of her London experiences. End of Chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Jane Austen and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sawasawaya in California. Jane Austen and Her Times by Geraldine Edith MITTON. Chapter 16. In London. During the years when she lived at Chawton, Jane stayed pretty frequently in London, generally with her brother Henry. She was with him in 1811, when he was in Sloane Street, going daily to the bank in Henrietta Street, Covent Garden, in which he was a partner. Mr. Austen Leigh says of Henry Austen, "He was a very entertaining companion, but had perhaps less steadiness of purpose, certainly less success in life than his brothers." Jane was evidently very fond of Henry, and fully appreciated his ready sympathy and interest in her affairs. In speaking of her young nephew, George Knight, she says, "George's inquiries were endless, and his eagerness in everything reminds me often of his Uncle Henry." Henry was at this time married to his cousin Eliza, widow of the Count de Fouillade, who has already been mentioned, and Eliza was evidently vivacious and fond of society, so her sister-in-law had by no means a dull time when staying with her. But how different were Jane's visits to London, unknown, and certainly without any idea of the fame that was to attend her later, to those of her forerunners and contemporaries who had been discovered, and who on the very slightest grounds were feted and adored. The company of Mrs. Austen's friends, a little shopping, an occasional visit to the play, these were the details which filled up the daily routine of Jane's visit. She made the acquaintance of many of her sister-in-law's French friends, and enjoyed a large musical party given by her where, including everybody, we were 66, and where the music was extremely good, harp, pianoforte, and singing. and the house was not clear till 12. It is not difficult to reconstruct the London that she knew. Roque's splendid map of the middle of the 18th century gives us a basis to go upon, though houses had been rapidly built since it was made. Even at Roque's date, London reached to Hyde Park Corner, and the district we call Mayfair was one of the smartest parts of the town. St. George's Hospital stood at the corner as at present, and a line of houses bordered the road running past it, but beyond this, over Belgravia, were open fields called the Five Fields, crossed by the rambling Westbourne stream and traversed by paths. Sloane Street itself had been planned in 1780 and was called after the famous Sir Hans Sloane, whose collection formed the nucleus of the British Museum. It was therefore comparatively new in Jane's time. To the south, near the river, there were a good many houses at Chelsea, that is to say south of King's Road, and Chelsea Hospital, of course, stood as at present. Next to it, where is now the strip of garden open to the public and lined by Bridge Road, stood the waste site and ruins of the famous Ranelagh Rotunda, which had been in its time the scene of so much gaiety. Only a few years previous to Jane's visit to Sloane Street, it had been demolished and the fittings sold. Vauxhall, however, the great rival of Ranelagh, was still popular, and continued with gradually waning patronage until after the middle of the 19th century. It does not appear that Jane ever went there, however. As for Knightsbridge, if we imagine all the great modern buildings such as Sloane Court and the barracks done away with, and picture a long unpaved road stretching away into fields and open country westward, with a few small houses of the brick box type on both sides, we get some idea of the district. Sloane Street was then, in fact, quite the end of London. Not long before, it had been dangerous to travel to the outlying village of Chelsea without protection at night, and it was not until another 14 years had passed that the 5 fields were laid out for building. In the London of that date, many things we now take as commonplace necessaries were altogether wanting, and if we could be carried back in time, it would be the negative side that would strike us most. For instance, there was very little pavement, and what there was composed of great rounded stones, like the worst sort of cobble paving in a provincial town. Most of the roads were made of gravel and dirt. Jane mentions a fresh load of gravel having been thrown down near Hyde Park Corner, which made the work so stiff that the horses refused the collar and jibbed. Growley tells us many little details which are just what we want to know, of the kind which in all ages are taken for granted by those who live amid them, so that they need a stranger to record them. He gives us first an account of his arrival in London by coach over Westminster Bridge. I arrived in London towards the close of the day. Though the sun was still above the horizon, the lamps were already lighted upon Westminster Bridge and upon the roads and streets that lead to it. These streets are broad, regular, and lined with high houses, forming the most beautiful quarter of London. The river covered with boats of different sizes, the bridge and the streets were filled with coaches, their broad footpaths crowded with people. The group of buildings on the west of the bridge belonged, of course, to the old palace, where, in the chapel of St. Stephen, sat the House of Commons. The abbey would be much as it is now, also St. Margaret's Church. The splendid Holbein Gate standing across Whitehall had been removed about 15 years before Growley's visit. He tells us that means, however, have been found to pave with freestone the great street called Parliament Street. The fine street called Pall Mall is already paved in part with this stone, and they have also begun to new pave the Strand. The 2 first of these streets were dry in May, all the rest of the town being still covered with heaps of dirt. The dirt is what strikes him most everywhere. In the most beautiful part of the Strand, and near St. Clement's Church, I have seen the middle of the street constantly foul with a dirty puddle to a height of 3 or 4 inches. A puddle where splashings cover those that walk on foot, field coaches when their windows happen not to be up, and bedaub all the lower parts of such houses as are exposed to it. The English are not afraid of this dirt, being defended from it by their wigs of a brownish curling hair, their black stockings, and their blue surtouts, which are made in the form of a nightgown. On each side of the road ran a kind of deep and dirty ditch called the kennel, into which refuse and rubbish was thrown, and from which evil and unwholesome odours came. When vehicles in passing splashed into this, a shower of filth would bespatter the passers-by behind the posts. Therefore it was of no small consequence to keep to the wall, and the giving up of this was by no means a mere matter of form, and frequently produced quarrels between hot-tempered men. Toward the end of the century, however, swords were not usually worn, except by physicians. Therefore these quarrels were not always productive of so much harm as they might have been. The streets were full of enormous coaches, sometimes gilt, hung on high springs, drawn by 4 and even 6 horses. Footmen to the number of 4 or 6 ran beside them, and the wheels splashed heavily in the dirt described, sending up the mud in black spurts. It was early in the 19th century that a new kind of paving was tried, blocks of cast iron covered with gravel, but this was not a success. Besides the large coaches, there were hackney coaches, which would seem to us almost equally clumsy and unwieldy. Omnibuses were not seen in the metropolis until 1823, but there was something of the kind running from outlying places to London, for Samuel Rogers tells a story as follows. "Visiting Lady Blank one day, I made inquiries about her sister. 'She is now staying with me,' answered Lady Blank, 'but she is unwell in consequence of a fright which she got on her way from Richmond to London.' On inquiry it turned out that while Miss Blank was coming to town, the footman, observing an omnibus approach, and thinking she might like to see it, suddenly called in at the carriage window, 'Ma'am, the omnibus!' She, being unacquainted with the term, and not sure but an omnibus might be a wild beast escaped from the zoological gardens, was thrown into a dreadful state of agitation by the announcement, and this caused her indisposition." Hackney coaches were in severe competition with sedan chairs, for to call a chair was as frequent a custom as to send for a hackney coach. The chairmen were notorious for their incivility, just as the watermen had previously been, and, as their successors, the cabmen became later, though now the reproach is removed from them. The rudeness of chairmen is exemplified in Tom Jones, for when Tom found himself, after the masked ball, unable to produce a shilling for a chair, he walked boldly on after the chair in which his lady rode, pursued by a grand huzzah from all the chairmen present, who wisely take the best care they can to discountenance all walking afoot by their betters. Luckily, however, the gentry who attended the opera house were too busy to quit their stations, and as the lateness of the hour prevented him from meeting many of their brethren in the street, he proceeded without molestation in a dress which at another season would have certainly raised a mob at his heels. These chairs were kept privately by great people, and often were very richly decorated with brocade and plush. It was not an unusual thing for the footman or chairman of the owner to be decoyed into a tavern while the chair was stolen for the sake of its valuable furniture. The chairs opened with a lid at the top to enable the occupant to stand up on entrance, and then were shut down. In the caricatures of the day, these lids are represented as open to admit of the lady's enormous feather being left on her head. It was, of course, quite impossible for a lady to go about alone in the streets of London at this date, and even dangerous sometimes for men. The porters, carriers, chairmen, drunken sailors, etc., ready to make a row, are frequently mentioned by Grosley, and scuffles were of constant occurrence. George Selwyn in 1782 was so mobbed, daubed, and beset by a crew of wretched little chimney-sweeps that he had to give them money to go away. These pests were under no sort of control, as there were no regular police in the streets. London has neither troops, patrol, or any sort of regular watch, and it is guarded during the night only by old men chosen from the dregs of the people, who have no other arms but a lantern and a pole, who patrol the streets crying the hour every time the clock strikes, who proclaim good and bad weather in the morning, who come to awake those who have any journey to perform, and whom it is customary with young rakes to beat and use ill, when they come reeling from the taverns where they have spent the night. Growly. It is bewildering to find that this sort of thing continued until George IV's reign, when Sir Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Act was passed. And in that lawless, rowdy age, one wonders how the town ever got on without police. Probably there were numerous deaths from violence. It carries us back almost to the Middle Ages to realize that so late as 1783, the last execution took place at Tyburn. Samuel Rogers recollected as a boy seeing a whole cartful of young girls in dresses of various colors on their way to execution for having been concerned in the burning of a house in the Gordon riots. Though some of these details belong to an age prior to that when Jane stayed in London, yet they lingered on until the 19th century with little change. In 1811, gas was just beginning to be used in lighting the streets. The town was in a strange transitional state. Pall Mall was first lighted with a row of gas lamps in 1807, and on the King's birthday, June 4th, the wall between Pall Mall and St. James's Park was brilliantly illuminated in the same way. But gas generally was not placed in the thoroughfares until 1812 or 1813, and meantime oil lamps, requiring much care and attention, were the only resource. It was a noisy, rattling, busy, dirty London then, as much distinguished for its fogs as it is at present. Monsieur Grosley was much struck with the fogs. We may add to the inconvenience of the dirt the fog smoke, which, being mixed with a constant fog, covers London and wraps it up entirely. On the 26th of April, St. James's Park was incessantly covered with fogs, smoke, and rain that scarce left a possibility of distinguishing objects at a distance of 4 steps. He speaks at another place of this smoke, being loaded with terrestrial particles and rolling in a thick, heavy atmosphere, forms a cloud which envelops London like a mantle, a cloud which the sun pervades but rarely, a cloud which, recoiling back upon itself, suffers the sun to break out only now and then, which casual appearance procures the Londoners a few of what they call glorious days. In regard to the main streets and squares in the West End, the greatest difference noticeable between the London of 1811 and of the present time would be the network of dirty and mean buildings overspreading the part where is now Trafalgar Square. In the middle of these stood the King's Mews, which had been rebuilt in 1732 and was not done away with until 1829. At the corner where Northumberland Avenue joins Charing Cross was the splendid mansion of the Duke of Northumberland, which remained until 1874. Another great difference lay in the fact of there being no Regent Street, for this street was not begun until 2 years after Jane's 1811 visit. Bond Street was there, and Piccadilly, and across the entrance to the park, where is now the Duke of York's column, was Carlton House, the home of the obstreperous Prince of Wales. In Monsieur Grosley's time, Leicester House in Leicester Fields was still standing, but in 1811 it had been pulled down. Grosley lodged near here, and his details as to rent, etc., are interesting. He says that the house of his landlord was small, only 3 stories high, standing on an irregular patch of ground, and rented at 38 guineas a year, with an additional guinea for the water supply, which was distributed 3 times weekly. In this house, 2 or 3 little rooms on the first story, very slightly furnished, were let to him at a guinea a week. The touch about the water supply points to another deficiency. All the present admirable system of private taps and other distributing agencies, also the network of drains, sewers, etc., had yet to be evolved, for sanitation was in a very elementary condition. Many of the shops were still distinguished by signs, for though the custom of numbering in place of signs had been introduced, it had made way but slowly. Thus we find Jane referring to "The tallow chandler is Pendington, at the Crown and Beehive, Charles Street, Covent Garden." It would be particularly pleasant to know where she did her own shopping in which she was femininely interested, but it is difficult to infer. But beyond the fact that Leighton and Shears was evidently the draper whom she patronized, and that Leighton and Shears is Bedford House, and that Fanny bought her Irish at Newton's in Leicester Square, we do not get much detail, but we glean a few particulars from this visit and one of a later date. Grafton House was evidently a famous place for shopping, for she and Fanny frequently paid visits there before breakfast, which was, however, generally much later than we have it, perhaps about 10. Jane says, "We must have been 3/4 of an hour at Grafton House, Edward sitting by all the time with wonderful patience. There Fanny bought the net for Anna's gown, and a beautiful square veil for herself. The edging there is very cheap. I was tempted by some, and I bought some very nice plaiting lace at 3 and 4 pence. Again, she says, "We set off immediately after breakfast and must have reached Grafton House by 11:30, but when we entered the shop the whole counter was thronged, and we waited full half an hour before we could be attended to. Fanny was much pleased with the stockings she bought of Remington, silk at 12 shillings, cotton at 4 shillings and 3 pence. She thinks them great bargains, but I have not seen them yet, as my hair was dressing when the man and the stockings came." It was quite the fashion at that time to patronize Wedgwood, whose beautiful china was much in vogue. The original founder of the firm had died in 1795, and had been succeeded by his son. We then went to Wedgwood's, where my brother and Fanny chose a dinner set. I believe the pattern is a small lozenge in purple, between lines of narrow gold, and it is to have the crest. This identical dinner set is still in the possession of the family. Mrs. Libby Powys also mentions Wedgwood. "In the morning we went to London a-shopping, and at Wedgwood's, as usual, were highly entertained, as I think no shop affords so great a variety." In the spring of 1813, Jane was again in London, and visited many picture galleries. The fact of having Fanny with her was enough to enhance greatly her pleasure in these sights. Mrs. Henry Austen had died in the early part of this year, leaving no children. Henry, of course, eventually married again, as did all the brothers with the exception of Edward Knight, but it was not for 7 years. His second wife was Eleanor, daughter of Henry Jackson. The house in Sloane Street was given up after his wife's death, and he went to Henrietta Street to be near the bank. It was here Jane came to him. A collection of Sir Joshua Reynolds' paintings was being exhibited in Pall Mall, though the great painter himself was dead. With her head full of Pride and Prejudice, which had recently been published, Jane looks in vain to discover any portrait that will do for Elizabeth Bennet, and failing to find one, she writes playfully, "I can only imagine that Darcy prizes any picture of her too much to like it should be exposed to the public eye. I can imagine he would have that sort of feeling, that mixture of love, pride, and delicacy." She, however, is more successful in finding one of Jane Bingley, Elizabeth's sister. Mrs. Bingley's is exactly herself. Size, shaped face, features and sweetness, there never was a greater likeness. She is dressed in a white gown with green ornaments, which convinces me of what I had always supposed, that green was a favourite colour with her. Kensington Gardens were at that time the resort of many of the fashionable. Jane mentions frequently walking there, though we doubt if she were attracted by the scenes of struggle and confusion that sometimes took place. From the Times of March 28, 1794, we learn, "The access to Kensington Gardens is so inconvenient to the visitors, it is to be hoped the politeness of those who have the direction of it will induce them to give orders for another door to be made for the convenience of the public. One door for admission and another for departure would prove a great convenience to the visitors. For want of this regulation the ladies frequently have their clothes torn to pieces, and are much hurt by the crowd passing different ways. 2 ladies were lucky enough to escape through the gate of Kensington Gardens on Sunday last, with only a broken arm each. When a few lives have been lost, perchance then a door or two may be made for the convenience of the families of the survivors. This shows that there was a wall or high paling running completely round the gardens. We find mentioned also the seats or boxes scattered up and down the grass plots, and moving on a pivot to catch the sun, a convenience it would be well to restore. When one realizes the crowds that habitually frequented the place, it seems as if there must be some mistake in the record that a man was accidentally shot in 1798 when the keepers were hunting foxes in Kensington Gardens. The Serpentine was made out of the Westbourne in 1730, and the gardens reclaimed, having been up to then a mere wilderness. During the reign of George II, the gardens were only open to the public on Saturdays, but when the court ceased to reside at Kensington Palace, they were open during the spring and summer. The broad walk seems to have been the most fashionable promenade, and doubtless there was frequently to be seen here some such crowd as that described by Tickell, when each walk with robes of various dyes bespread seems from afar a moving tulip bed, where rich brocades and glossy damasks glow, and chintz, the rival of the showery bow. During most of her visits to London, Jane went several times to the theatre, chiefly to Covent Garden and Drury Lane, which were then considered far the best, though there were many others existing, among which were the Adelphi, which had been opened in 1806, Astley's Amphitheatre for the exhibition of trained horses, which was very popular, the Haymarket or Little Theatre, taken down in 1820, the Lyceum, which was then the Opera House, having been enlarged in 1809, the Olympic, which belonged to Astley, and where there was the same style of show as at his other theatre, the Pantheon, Oxford Street, chiefly for masquerades and concerts, reopened as an opera house in 1812 and sold up in 1814. The Queen's, near Tottenham Court Road, not much known or frequented, a description which also applies to the Old Royalty in Wells Street and others. Among places of amusement must also be enumerated the Italian Opera House, which stood where His Majesty's Theatre is at present. It was opened in 1705, burnt down in 1789, and rebuilt the following year. Of the 2 principal theatres, Covent Garden had been opened by Rich in 1737. It was afterwards greatly enlarged and improved, and in 1803 John Kemble became proprietor. Only 5 years later it was burnt to the ground. The new theatre, built on the same site, was reopened in 1809 when the prices were raised. They had been boxes 4 shillings, pit 2 shillings 6pence, first gallery 1 shilling 6pence, upper gallery 1 shilling. There were then no stalls, and persons of quality had to go to boxes. The prices demanded by Kemble were boxes 7 shillings, pit 3 shillings, gallery 2 shillings, while the upper gallery remained the same. A fearful riot broke out on the first night of the new prices, and the mob would hear no explanations, listen to no reason. The members who banded themselves together adopted the name of O.P. for old prices, and would not allow the play to proceed, making an indescribable din with whistles, catcalls, and shrieks. After weeks of dispute, a compromise was arrived at, the higher price being retained in the case of the boxes. At an earlier date, some of the audience had actually been seated on the stage among the performers, and there were still in Jane's time boxes on the stage, but outside the curtain. We can see this in the illustration of the Little Theatre Haymarket, where the pit comes right up to the footlights, there being no stalls, and the patrons of the pit are seated on backless benches not divided into compartments. We gather from contemporary literature that it was a common thing to go to rehearsals of the performances at the opera, and that there was a coffee room attached, which formed at least as great an attraction to the idle rich, who loved to chatter sweet nothings, as the piece itself. Kemble was the brother of Mrs. Siddons, and did as much as any man for the improvement of the stage. When he first began his career, he was struck by the ludicrous conventionality of the dresses, which were as much a matter of form as the custom of representing statues of living men in Roman habit. He and the great Garrick killed this foolish custom. The conventionalism in matters of dress upon the stage is noticed by the ubiquitous Monsieur Grosley thus: "On the stage the principal actresses drag long trains after them, and are followed by a little boy in quality of a train-bearer, who is as inseparable from them as the shadow from the body. This page keeps his eye constantly upon the train of the princess, sets it to rights when it is ever so little ruffled or disordered, and is seen to run after it with all his might when a violent emotion makes the princess hurry from one side of the stage to another." Drury Lane Theatre has an older record than Covent Garden. It dates from 1663, and in 1682 was the only theatre in London, being considered sufficient for the joint representations of the two old established companies of players, the King's and the Duke's. It was many times rebuilt, being more than once destroyed by fire. In fact, nothing is more striking in the annals of theatres than the astonishing number of times nearly every theatre has been burnt down. The third house was burnt in February 1809, and its successor opened in 1812, with a prologue by Lord Byron. During Jane Austen's first recorded visit to London, therefore, it would be in course of rebuilding, though on subsequent visits it would be very fashionable, being new. Just as in novels during the lifetime of Jane Austen, there was an enormous change from the grandiloquent and conventional to the natural and simple, and the same in poetry, so it was on the stage. The absurd conventionalism, the unsuitable dresses, no matter what, so long as they were grand, were exchanged for easy declamation and natural attitude. Garrick, as we have said, was one of the first actors to begin this movement, and it is no wonder that he won the applause of London, and that crowds came to hear him, so that in 1744, when he was to act Hamlet, servants were sent at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to keep places for their employers, for there were then no such things as reserved seats. Fine actors and actresses abounded in the 18th century. Mrs. Siddons, who was born in 1755, did not give her farewell performance in Lady Macbeth until 1812, and lived long after. Both Mrs. Oldfield and Peg Woffington, however, had passed away before Jane's time. It was an age when people were wild about acting, and private theatres were a common hobby. Many a young spark ruined himself in this extravagance, and the Times of 1798 mentions that there were no fewer than 6 private theatres in London and Westminster. The plays commented upon in Jane's letters seem to us very dull. "Fanny and the 2 little girls are gone to take places for tonight at Covent Garden, Clandestine Marriage and Midas. The latter will be a fine show for Lizzie and Marianne. They revelled last night in Don Juan, whom we left in hell at 11:30. We had Scaramouche and a ghost, and were delighted. I speak of them. My delight was very tranquil, and the rest of us were sober-minded. Don Juan was the last of 3 musical things. 5 hours at Brighton in 3 acts, and the Beehive, rather less flat and trumpery. We had good places in the box next the stage box. I was particularly disappointed at seeing nothing of Mr. Crabbe. I felt sure of him when I saw the boxes were fitted up with crimson velvet. The new Mr. Terry was Lord Ogleby, and Henry thinks he may do, but there was no acting more than moderate. In the following year, 1814, her comments are, "We went to the play again last night. The Farmer's Wife is a musical thing in 3 acts, and as Edward was steady in not staying for anything more, we were home before 10. Fanny and Mr. J.P. are delighted with Miss S. All that I am sensible of is a pleasing person and no skill in acting. We had Matthews, Liston, and Enery. Of course, some amusement. Prepare for a play at the very first evening. I rather think Covent Garden to see Young in Richard. Miss S. was probably Miss Stevens, a singer who made her debut in 1812 in concerts and appeared on the stage at Covent Garden in 1813. she afterwards became Countess of Essex. She was considered unsurpassed for her rendering of ballads. Jane mentions her again. "We are to see The Devil to Pay tonight. I expect to be very much amused. Excepting Miss Stevens, I dare say Artaxerxes will be very tiresome." The Matthews she mentions was Charles Matthews Sr. Liston was at first master of St. Martin's Grammar School, Leicester Square, but became a popular actor, and at the time of her writing was appearing at Covent Garden. But by far the best actor she records having seen is Kean. "We were quite satisfied with Kean. I cannot imagine better acting, but the part was too short, and excepting him and Miss Smith, and she did not quite answer my expectation, the parts were ill-filled and the play heavy. We were too much tired for the whole of Illusion, Nourjahad, which has 3 acts. There is a great deal of finery and dancing in it, but I think little merit. Elliston was Nourjahad, but I think it is a solemn sort of part, not at all calculated for his powers. There was nothing of the best Elliston about him. I might not have known him but for his voice. And later, I shall like to see Kean again excessively, and to see him with you too. It appeared to me as if there were no fault in him anywhere, and in his scene with Tubal there was exquisite acting." In another place she says that so great was the rage for seeing Kean that only a 3rd or 4th row could be got, and that "he is more admired than ever." This is very different from Miss Mitford's account of her first impressions of the great actor. "Well, I went to see Mr. Kean and was thoroughly disgusted. This monarch of the stage is a little insignificant man, slightly deformed, strongly ungraceful, seldom pleasing the eye, still seldomer satisfying the ear, with a voice between grunting and croaking, a perpetual hoarseness which suffocates his words, and a vulgarity of manner which his admirers are pleased to call nature. His acting will always be, if not actually insupportable, yet unequal, disappointing, and destructive of all illusion." But, as in her account of Darcy and Elizabeth, we have seen that Miss Mitford preferred the stereotyped and conventional to the natural, of which Jane Austen was so ardent an admirer. Therefore we cannot feel much surprise at the difference between the two opinions. Jane evidently enjoyed good acting, but was critical and not a great lover of the drama, unless it was very well done. This we might expect, for naturalness was her admiration, and naturalness she would only find in first-rate performers such as Kean. End of Chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Jane Austen and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paula Priebe, Wausau, Wisconsin. Jane Austen and Her Times by Geraldine Edith MITTON. Chapter 17. Fanny and Anna. The nephews and nieces at Godmersham were rapidly growing into men and women. Edward and George, on leaving Winchester, went to Oxford. The luxurious way which they were brought up evidently sometimes annoyed their aunt, who was accustomed to see the younger generation more repressed. She says of them, "As I wrote of my nephews with a little bitterness in my last, I think it particularly incumbent on me to do them justice now, and I have great pleasure in saying they were both at the sacrament yesterday. Now these 2 boys, who were out with the foxhounds, will come home and disgust me again by some habit of luxury or some proof of sporting mania." While Jane was at Godmersham in 1813, her brother Charles, his wife, and little daughters were there too. It was the custom then, though not an invariable one, but a matter of inclination, for a captain in the navy to take his wife and children voyaging with them. It will be remembered that in Persuasion, Captain Wentworth says he hates to hear of women on board, and Mrs. Croft, whose husband is an admiral, declares women may be as comfortable on board as in the best house in England. I believe I have lived as much on board as most women, and I know nothing superior to the accommodation of a man of war. Charles Austen's wife and children seem to have spent a good deal of time on board with him, and Cassie, the eldest girl, a delicate, quiet child, suffered from seasickness during rough weather. Jane says affectionately of her, "Poor little love, I wish she were not so very palmery, but it seems stronger than ever. I never knew a wife's family features to have such undue influence." Cassie was not quite happy among her cousins. They are too many and too boisterous for her. Jane speaks of her and her mother as being their own nice selves, Fanny looking as neat and white this morning as possible, and Charles all affectionate, placid, quiet, cheerful good humour. Alas, in September of the following year, Mrs. Charles Austen died in childbirth. Her husband, who was a very domestic man, felt the loss severely. Subsequently, he married her sister Harriet, and became the father of 2 boys in addition to his little daughters. In 1814, Edward Knight was annoyed by a claimant to the Chawton estate, and it appears from what Miss Mitford says on the subject in her letters, that this was in consequence of old Mr. Knight's not having fulfilled some technical point in connection with the property. As Chawton was worth about £5,000 a year, the matter was serious, and that it was not altogether a fancy originating in the mind of the claimant is shown by the fact that after protracted discussions Edward Knight did, in 1817, pay him a sum of money to settle the matter. We have no letters of Jane's before November 1815, but she was probably at home at Chawton with her sister and mother, when the news that Napoleon had escaped from Elba burst upon the world like a thunderclap. The call to arms rang throughout Europe, and then followed the terrible 100 days which ended on June the 18th with the Battle of Waterloo. Alison, in his Epitome of the History of Europe, says, "No one who was of an age to understand what was going on can ever forget the entrancing joy which thrilled through the British heart at the news of Waterloo. The thanks of Parliament were voted to Wellington and his army. A medal struck by government was given to every officer and soldier who had borne arms on that eventful day, and not less than £500,000 was raised by voluntary subscription for those wounded in the fight and the widows and orphans of the fallen." We wonder if the house at Chawton contributed its mite among the rest. Jane's heart surely must have thrilled in unison with those of her countrymen. Louis XVIII was once more placed on the throne of his fathers, and Napoleon was sent to St. Helena. He arrived there on November the 16th, and by that date Jane was again in London nursing her brother Henry. Between 1814 and 1816, many charming letters passed between Jane and her young niece Fanny, and as these contain more of the personal element than any of the others that have been preserved, they are among the most interesting of all. At the beginning of these letters Fanny was 21, which in those days was considered quite a staid age for an unmarried girl. In one of her letters she tells her aunt that her feelings had cooled towards someone who at one time she had thought of marrying. Jane's answer is full of sense and sympathy, and gives us much insight into her own views on the relations of the sexes. "What strange creatures we are," she writes. "It seems as if your being secure of him had made you indifferent. There was a little disgust, I suspect, at the races, and I do not wonder at it. His expressions, then, would not do, for one who had rather more acuteness, penetration, and taste, than love, which was your case. And yet, after all, I am surprised that the change in feeling should be so great. He is just what he ever was, only more evidently and uniformly devoted to you. Oh, dear Fanny, your mistake has been one that thousands of women fall into. He was the first young man who attached himself to you. That was the charm, and most powerful it is. Upon the whole, what is to be done? You have no inclination for any other person. His situation in life, family, friends, and above all his character, his uncommonly amiable mind, strict principles, just notions, good habits, all that you know so well how to value, all that is really of the first importance, pleads his case most strongly. You have no doubt of his having superior abilities. He has proved it at the university. He is, I dare say, such a scholar as your agreeable idle brothers would ill bear comparison with. The more I read about him, the more strongly I feel the desirableness of your growing in love with him again. There are such beings in the world, perhaps 1 in 1,000, as the creature you and I should think perfection, where grace and spirit are united to worth, where the manners are equal to the heart and understanding. But such a person may not come in your way, or, if he does, he may not be the eldest son of a man of fortune, the near relation of your own particular friend, and belonging to your own country. And now, my dear Fanny, having written so much on one side of the question, I shall turn around and entreat you not to commit yourself farther, and not to think of accepting him unless you really do like him. Anything is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. And if his deficiencies of manner strike you more than all his good qualities, if you continue to think strongly of them, give him up at once. When I consider how few young men you have yet seen much of, how capable you are of being really in love, and how full of temptation the next 6 or 7 years of your life will probably be, I cannot wish you, with your present very cool feelings, to devote yourself in honour to him. It is very true that you may never attach another man his equal altogether, but if that other man has the power of attaching you more, he will be in your eyes the most perfect. You are inimitable, irresistible, you are the delight of my life. Such letters, such entertaining letters as you have sent, such a description of your queer little heart, such a lovely display of what imagination does. You are so odd, and all the time so perfectly natural, so peculiar in yourself, and yet so like everybody else. It is very, very gratifying to me to know you so intimately. Oh, what a loss it will be when you are married. You are too agreeable in your single state. I shall hate you when your delicious play of mind is all settled down into conjugal and maternal affections. And yet I do wish you to marry very much, because I know you will never be happy till you are. And later on, apropos of someone else, she adds, single women have a dreadful propensity for being poor, which is one very strong argument in favor of matrimony. But I need not dwell on such arguments with you, pretty dear. To you I shall say, as I have often said before, do not be in a hurry, the right man will come at last. You will, in the course of the next 2 or 3 years, meet with somebody more generally unexceptionable than anyone you have yet known, who will love you as warmly as possible, and who will so completely attract you that you will feel you never really loved before. But it was not until 1820 that Fanny married, as his second wife, the Right Honourable Sir Edward Knatchbull, 9th Baronet, who had already 5 sons and 1 daughter, the eldest boy being 12 years old. 6 years after the marriage, the daughter married Fanny's brother Edward. She herself lived to nearly 90, and was the mother of 5 sons and 4 daughters, and in 1880 her eldest son was created Baron Brabourne, and he, as has already been stated, was the editor of the volume of letters. But Jane's sympathetic advice was called for by more than one niece passing through the difficult time between girlhood and womanhood. Anna, her eldest brother James's daughter, was a frequent visitor at Chawton, and though she does not seem ever to have taken quite the same position in her aunt's affections as Fanny did, she was yet a lively, amusing, pleasant girl. She had evidently determined to follow in her aunt's footsteps, as was most natural, and had attempted to write a novel herself. Jane's treatment of her tentative efforts was very kind. Some of the letters to the would-be authoress are preserved, and nothing could be gentler. I am very much obliged to you for sending me your manuscript. It has entertained me extremely, indeed all of us. I read it aloud to your grandmamma and Aunt Cass, and we were all very pleased. The spirit does not drop at all. Now we have finished the 2nd book, or rather the 5th. Susan is a nice animated little creature, but St. Julian is the delight of our lives. He is quite interesting. The whole of his break-off with Lady Helena is very well done. And then she goes into great detail into all the characters, making various suggestions. You are but now coming to the heart and beauty of your story. Until the heroine grows up, the fun must be imperfect. But I expect a great deal of entertainment from the next 3 or 4 books, and I hope you will not resent these remarks by sending me no more. Then she gives 1 or 2 characteristic touches. Devereux Forester's being ruined by his vanity is extremely good, but I wish you would not let him plunge into a vortex of dissipation. I do not object to the thing, but cannot bear the expression. It is such thorough novel slang, and so old that I dare say Ada met with it in the first novel he opened. In 1814, Anna was engaged to Benjamin Lefroy, whom she married in November. After her marriage she first lived at Hendon, but in the following year she and her husband took a small house near Alton, so that she was within a walk of Chawton. She still went on with her novel writing, and Jane continued to criticize her progress. We have no great right to wonder at Benjamin Lefroy's not valuing the name of Progillian. That is a source of delight which even he can hardly be quite competent to. St. Julian's history was quite a surprise to me. You had not known it very long yourself, I suspect. His having been in love with the aunt gives Cecilia an additional interest with him. I like the idea, a very proper compliment to the aunt. I rather imagine indeed that nieces are seldom chosen but out of compliment to some aunt or other. I dare say Ben was in love with me once, and would never have thought of you if he had not supposed me dead of scarlet fever. Anna became the mother of 6 daughters and 1 son, and lived until 1872. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Jane Austen and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paula Priebe, Wausau, Wisconsin. Jane Austen and Her Times by Geraldine Edith MITTON. Chapter 18. The Prince Regent and Emma. In October 1815, Henry Austen was dangerously ill. He had by this time moved into another house, which was in Hans Place, quite near his former residence in Sloane Street, though the connection with the bank in Henrietta Street was still kept up. Both his sisters were with him at first, and an express was sent for his brother Edward, so critical was his state considered to be. But he rallied, and afterwards, when he was out of danger, Edward and Cassandra went down to Chawton, and Jane was left to nurse him back to complete health. The ideas of medicine at that time were primitive, and consisted chiefly of unmitigated bloodletting, an extraordinary custom, which must have been responsible for many a weak body's giving up the ghost. This incredible system is exemplified in the following anecdote. When Mrs. Libby Powys's son Philip had a coach accident, she comments on his treatment thus: "He has not, since the accident, tasted a bit of meat, or drunk a drop of wine, had a perpetual blister ever since, and blooded every 3 or 4 days for many weeks." Well may the editor of the book remark, "Truly Mr. Powys's enduring this treatment was a survival of the fittest." There was then a wide distinction between the physician and the apothecary, which may be noted in Jane's playful repudiation. "You seem to be under a mistake as to Mr. H. You call him an apothecary. He is no apothecary. He has never been an apothecary. There is not an apothecary in the neighborhood. Only the inconvenience of situation, perhaps. But so it is. We have not a medical man within reach. He is a Haydn, nothing but a Haydn, a sort of wonderful nondescript creature on 2 legs, something between a man and an angel, but without the least spice of an apothecary. He is perhaps the only person not an apothecary hereabouts." As it happened, this nursing of her brother brought her into public notice, for the physician who attended Henry Austen was also a physician of the Prince Regent's. At that time, though Jane's name had not appeared on the title page of her books, there was no longer any secret as to the writer's identity, and the doctor told her one day that the Prince of Wales, who had been made regent in 1811, was a great admirer of her novels. This is the only good thing one ever heard of George IV, and one cannot help doubting the fact. It is hard to imagine his reading any book, however delightful. The physician, however, added that the prince read the novels often, and kept a set in every one of his residences. Further, he himself had told the prince that the author was in London, and he had desired his librarian to wait upon her. The librarian, Mr. Clark, duly came, and Jane was invited to go to Carlton House, but it does not seem that the prince himself deigned to bestow any personal notice upon her, or that he even saw her. She saw Mr. Clark and Mr. Clark alone, and therefore one begins to feel tolerably sure that it was from Mr. Clark the whole thing originated. This worthy man deserves some credit, but that he was lacking in any sense of humor or knowledge of life was evidenced by his ponderous suggestions as to further books, one of which was that Jane should delineate in some future work the habits of life, character, and enthusiasm of a clergyman, who should pass his time between the metropolis and the country, who should be something like Beattie's minstrel. And, when this was rejected, an historical romance illustrative of the august house of Coburg would just now be very interesting. Jane's reply is full of good sense and excellently expressed. "You are very kind in your hints as to the sort of composition which might recommend me at present, and I am fully sensible that an historical romance, founded on the house of Coburg, might be much more to the purpose of profit or popularity than such pictures of domestic life in country villages as I deal in. But I could no more write a romance than an epic poem. I could not sit seriously down to write a serious romance under any other motive than to save my life. And if it were indispensable for me to keep it up, and never relax into laughing at myself or at other people, I am sure I should be hung before I had finished the first chapter. I must keep to my own style and go on in my own way. And though I may never succeed again in that, I am convinced that I should totally fail in any other." From Mr. Austen Leigh's memoir. She, however, gladly agreed to dedicate her next work to His Royal Highness. The next work was Emma, then nearly ready for publication. Mr. Murray was the publisher, and the dedication, which had been graciously accepted, appeared on the title page. The state of the court at the time is abundantly pictured in numerous memoirs, diaries, journals, etc., not the least among which is that of Miss Burney, Jane's contemporary and sister authoress. George III had one very striking virtue, striking in his time and position, and especially among his family. He seems to have lived a good domestic life. He had been married young, to a princess who had no beauty to recommend her, and his first feelings on seeing her had been those of disappointment. But being a sensible, kindly man, he had soon learnt the value of a good heart and the nature of a girl who had come so far to marry a man she had never seen. Their numerous family linked them together, and though the sons were a constant source of trouble and notorious in their wild lives, the tribe of princesses seemed to have endeared themselves to everyone by their gracious manners. Poor old George himself, with his well-meant, what, and his homely ways, could never offend intentionally, and the sweet queen, as Miss Burney so fulsomely calls her, though fully conscious of her own dignity, and not disposed to make a fuss about the hardships inseparable from the position of her waiting women, was yet at the bottom kind-hearted too. As for most of the princes, however, their ways were a byword and scandal. In every contemporary book we read of their being drunk, and otherwise disgracing themselves. The Prince of Wales and the Duke of York were the worst, and the Dukes of Clarence and Kent seem to have been the best. At Brighton, where the Prince of Wales had established his pavilion, orgies of drink and coarseness went on that disgusted even those accustomed to very free manners. The princes appeared in public with their mistresses, and reeled into public ballrooms. The prince's treatment of his own ill-used wife is well known. Purely from caprice, and without a shadow of justification, she, the mother of his only child, Princess Charlotte, was dismissed from her home, and forbidden any of the privileges or respect due her rank, a course of treatment which made England despised among the nations. Of the other two, we read, "The Duke of Kent is certainly one of the most steady-looking of the princes. Perhaps he may be heavy, but he has unquestionably the most of a man of business in his appearance." And Horace Walpole says, "My neighbour, the Duke of Clarence, is so popular that if Richmond were a borough, and he had not attained his title, but still retained his idea of standing candidate, he would certainly have been elected there. He pays his bills regularly himself, locks up his doors at night that his servants may not stay out late, and never drinks but a few glasses of wine. Though the value of crowns has mightily fallen of late at market, it looks as if his Royal Highness thought they were still worth waiting for. Nay, it is said that he tells his brothers that he shall be king before either. This is fair at least." He was afterwards William IV. The Prince of Wales mixed freely in political intrigues of the worst kind, and took part in faction politics. As a man, he was a contemptible creature, without character or intellect, but, in spite of all his faults, he had a certain number of admirers, because, as a young man, he was graceful and obliging in manners. And personal graciousness in a sovereign covers a multitude of sins. It is incongruous that a pure, sweet story such as Emma should have been dedicated to a man whose faults and vices were such as the clean-minded author could never have conceived. But the dedication probably served the purpose of advertising this, the last novel that Jane herself was to see issued to the public. Emma ranks very high indeed among the novels, but it relies for its position on a different sort of excellence from that which distinguishes Pride and Prejudice. There is in it, as we might have expected, more finished workmanship and less of the brilliancy of youth. The book is not so lively as Pride and Prejudice, and its somewhat slow opening, unlike Jane's usual style, is enough to discourage some readers who expect to be plunged into a scene such as that which begins her first novel, or which comes very soon in Sense and Sensibility. Emma has, however, more plot than is usual in Jane Austen's writings. It is more deliberately constructed, and yet the whole scene takes place in a quiet country village without once changing. The heroine Emma, whose domestic importance as the only unmarried daughter of a wealthy widower has given her a full idea of her own value, has developed her individuality very strongly. She is not spoiled, but all her words and actions betoken one accustomed to impress her will on her surroundings, in a way not often allowed to unmarried girls at home. The motif is her matchmaking propensity, which again and again brings her to grief. This affords opening for many of the humorous touches in which the author delights. The book is very rich in secondary characters. The garrulous, kind-hearted Miss Bates, with her rattling tongue, is one of the strongly individualized comic characters which Jane generally manages to insert. She ranks with Mr. Collins, with Mrs. Norris, and the lesser specimens of the same gallery, Mrs. Allen and Mrs. Jennings. She is admirably true to life, just such a garrulous, empty-headed, good-hearted, tiresome creature as many a governess of the old school has degenerated into in the evening of her life. Emma's father, the valetudinarian Mr. Woodhouse, has been said to be overdrawn, but the great merit of Jane's work is that she does not exaggerate. Traits to be found in people that any of us might number among our acquaintance are so skillfully depicted as to appear prominent. She selects true, if extreme, types, and does not draw monstrosities such as those in which Dickens's books abound, and of which one can only say they may have existed once, at one time, but are as rare as the exhibits in a dime museum. Mr. Woodhouse's married daughter, Mrs. Knightley, is excellently done. Her sympathy with her father's tastes is only kept in check by her affection for husband and children, which forces her to attend to them and forget herself. Yet the enjoyment with which she sips her gruel, when allowed to have it, is real enjoyment, and she would have certainly lived on gruel too had she been an old maid. The hero, Mr. Knightley, is one of the few sensible men among Jane's heroes, and he, with his experience and strength of character, is, as has been said elsewhere, the only true mate for Emma. Knightley has been criticized as a prig, but he is far from that. He was a stern, elderly man, apparently at least 45 in age, though we are told he was only 30. Emma herself has more ability than her rival, Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Her mind has more depth and application. We could imagine Emma reading and studying, whereas, pleasant as Elizabeth may have been as a companion, her forte was generally intelligent interest, not depth, and we could not picture her deeply absorbed in any book but a novel. Emma was one of Jane's own favorite heroines, and she said of her, "I am going to draw a heroine whom no one but myself will much like." It is true that for the generality of men, Emma would, in real life, have been just a little too strong, but she is nonetheless interesting to read about. Mr. Elton has been commented on in the chapter on clergymen. A more perfect match than he and his vulgar, flashy wife would be difficult to find. As for Jane's traits of character in regard to the hero and his brother, her genius cannot be better expressed than in the words of Mr. Harrys Pollock, who calls it the finely touched likeness and unlikeness between the brothers Knightley. At every turn of phrase, at every step, so to speak, one knows which is the better man, and yet the point is never pressed by the author. Though on the whole the book has less verve than Pride and Prejudice, it is rich in observation and quiet humor. It was published by Mr. Murray in December 1815. Jane says of it, "My greatest anxiety at present is that this fourth work should not disgrace what was good in the others, but on this point I will do myself the justice to declare that, whatever may be my wishes for its success, I am strongly haunted with the idea that to those readers who have preferred Pride and Prejudice, it will appear inferior in wit, and to those who have preferred Mansfield Park, inferior in good sense." From Mr. Austen Leigh's Memoir. A reviewer in the Quarterly of autumn 1815 includes Emma with other works of the same writer. It has been supposed, therefore, that the proof sheets must have been in the hands of the Quarterly reviewer before the work was actually issued. Mr. Austin Dobson, by application to Mr. Murray, cleared up the difficulty, for he ascertained that, owing to exceptional delay, the number of the review bearing date October 1815 did not in reality come out until March 1816, and that therefore Emma had actually appeared before its production. The reviewer was Sir Walter Scott, as is stated by Lockhart in a note to the Life, who adds that Emma and Northanger Abbey were in particular great favourites of Scott's. In his summary at the end of the article, Sir Walter Scott says, "The author's knowledge of the world and the particular tact with which she presents characters that the readers cannot fail to recognize reminds us something of the merits of the Flemish school of painting. The subjects are not often elegant, and certainly never grand, but they are finished up to nature, and with a precision which delights the reader. The faults, on the contrary, arise from the minute detail with which the author's plan comprehends. Characters of folly or simplicity, such as those of old Woodhouse and Miss Bates, are ridiculous when first presented, but if too often brought forward or too long dwelt upon, their prosing is apt to become as tiresome in fiction as in real society. In this we cannot agree. To accuse Jane of it is to accuse her of lacking the very gift in which she was preeminent, selection. The merit of her bores is that they never bore, but are only amusing. She never proses, and her few paragraphs of quotation from the sayings of Miss Bates set that lady before us as clearly, or more clearly, than if 50 pages from the actual life had been given by the phonograph." From what Jane says, she apparently saw this article in March 1816, when she was back at Chawton, for she writes, "The authoress of Emma has no reason, I think, to complain of her treatment in it, except in the total omission of Mansfield Park. I cannot but be sorry that so clever a man as the reviewer of Emma should consider it as unworthy of being noticed." That Jane was satisfied with her treatment by Mr. Murray may be seen by her handing over to him the conduct of the second edition of Mansfield Park. She writes in one place, "I had a most civil note in reply from Mr. Murray. He is so very polite indeed that it is quite overcoming." At this time she must have begun the last and shortest of her books, Persuasion, which she finished in August of the same year. And with this we enter on the last phase, the gradual decline and sinking of the bright spirit, which has added so greatly to the happiness of thousands it had never known. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Jane Austen and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paula Priebe, Wausau, Wisconsin. Jane Austen and Her Times by Geraldine Edith Mitton. Chapter 19. Last Days. The evening of Jane's life had set in, but yet it had not occurred even to those who loved her best that they must inevitably lose her. She was in her 41st year, recognition from the public had just begun to be accorded to her. In the novels she had lately written, no sign of decay could be detected. It is true that in both Emma and Persuasion there is a particular maturity of rendering, and a kindlier tone that marks perhaps a difference, but not degeneracy. If the word seriousness can ever be used of such clear-cut, brilliant work as hers, we might say that a certain sweet seriousness pervaded these two, which are more alike in tone than any of the other novels. Persuasion has been called the most beautiful of all the novels. It has many excellencies, not the least among which is the character of the heroine, whose girlish weakness develops into a loyal steadfastness. She has also that endearingness that perhaps certain others of the heroines lack. In fact, of all the principal female characters, that of Anne Elliot has most of that nameless and indefinable charm which comes from a combination of qualities such as firmness, gentleness, unselfishness, sympathy, and sweetness, a charm which is more lovable than any number of stereotyped graces. Though Anne was at one time weak, we feel that she outgrows it, that it was the weakness of immaturity, not of character, and that her loyalty fully redeems it. Jane herself says of Anne Elliot, "You may perhaps like the heroine, as she is almost too good for me." Yet the too good note seems less obtrusive with Anne than with Fanny Price, whose exceeding surface meekness does sometimes produce a little exasperation. Anne and Fanny have the most in common among the heroines of the novels, yet what a difference is there! Fanny has many virtues, but her intense nervous sensitiveness makes one feel her self-consciousness, and underlying all her shrinking there was a quality of obstinacy that is felt without being insisted upon. It is just the subtle difference that Jane knew so well how to make. The feeling, perhaps, is that Fanny is not quite a gentlewoman, that she would be difficult to get on with, however meek and self-effacing on the surface, while Anne could never be anything but a delightful companion. Incidentally, some parts of Persuasion have already been referred to. Louisa Musgrove's fall on the cob, the scenes that take place in Bath, the touching words of Anne when she feels that she has hopelessly lost her lover, which strike a deeper note of feeling than any other in the whole range of the novels. It remains therefore but to say that there is no secondary character equal to those of Miss Bates or Mr. Collins, that the secondary characters are in all cases less sharply defined than those usually depicted by Jane, but that Captain Wentworth is equal to his good fortune, and that as a pair of lovers he and Anne stand unrivaled. Persuasion was finished in July 1816, but Jane was not satisfied with it. Perhaps her own failing health and the sense of tiredness that went with it had made her lose that grip of the action that she had hitherto held so well. She felt that the story did not end satisfactorily, that it wanted bringing together and clinching, so to speak. Mr. Austen Leigh says, "This weighed upon her mind, the more so probably on account of her weak state of health, so that one night she retired to rest in very low spirits. But such depression was little in accordance with her nature, and was soon shaken off. The next morning she woke to more cheerful views and brighter inspirations. The sense of power revived, and imagination resumed its course. She cancelled the condemned chapter, and wrote 2 others, entirely different in its stead." These are the 10th and 11th chapters, and contain the scene in which Anne so touchingly expresses her ideas on the theme of women's love. There is no question that the story as it now stands is improved by the change, and that her instinct was true. Mr. Austen Leigh gives the cancelled chapter in his memoir, and it certainly is tame and flat, compared to others. And had she not made the substitution, it might justly have been said that Persuasion, however charming, did show signs of failing power. This book was not published until after her death, when it appeared in 1 volume with Northanger Abbey, the first to which her name was prefixed. This came out in 1818, with a memoir by her brother Henry. Up to the time of her death she had received nearly £700 for the published books, which, considering her anonymity and entire lack of publicity and influence, must have appeared to her, and indeed was, wonderful, though in comparison with the true value of the work, very little indeed. In December 1816 her brothers, Henry and Charles, were both at Chawton, and she speaks of their being in good health and spirits. She got through the winter well, and wrote to a friend in January, "Such mild weather is, you know, delightful to us, and though we have a great many ponds and a fine running stream through the meadows on the other side of the road, it is nothing but what beautifies us and does to talk of. I have certainly gained strength through the winter, and am not far from being well. And I think I understand my own case now so much better than I did, as to be able by care to keep off any serious return of illness." She had taken to using a donkey carriage in good weather, and doubtless this was a great boon, though she was able to walk one way either to or from Alton without over-fatigue, and hoped to be able to manage both ways when the summer came. In January she also mentions that her brother Henry, who was now ordained, was coming down to preach. It will be a nervous hour for our pew, though we hear that he acquits himself well, with as much ease and collectedness as if he had been used to it all his life. Her last completed book, Persuasion, was not her last work. Even in declining health, the motive power was unabated. Upon a fitful revival of her strength at the beginning of 1817, she fell eagerly to work at a story, of which she wrote 12 chapters. It has no name, and the plot and purpose are undeveloped. But some of the personages sketched have more than promise. There is a Mr. Parker, with fixed theories as to the fashionable watering place he hopes to evolve out of a Sussex fishing village. There is a rich and vulgar Lady Denham, who will certainly disappoint her relatives by the testamentary disposition of her property. And there are 2 maiden ladies who thoroughly enjoy bad health, and quack themselves to their heart's content. Whatever the plot to be unravelled, there is no sign that the writer's hand had lost its cunning. From Mr. Austen Dobson's preface to Macmillan's edition of Northanger Abbey. We are told by Mr. Austen Leigh that the date on the last chapter of this manuscript was March 17, which, as the watch of a drowned man denotes the time of his death, so does this final date seem to fix the period when her mind could no longer pursue its accustomed course. It was in March that her own family began to think seriously of the malady that was so insidiously making inroads on her vitality. Her niece Caroline, Anna's half-sister, and sister of the Mr. Austen Leigh to whose memoir the world is so much indebted, was then a child of 12. She came about the end of March to stay at Chawton, but found her aunt so ill that she could not be taken in, and so she was sent to her half-sister, Anna Lefroy. In her private record she gives the following account from recollection. The next day we walked over to Chawton to make inquiries after our aunt. She was then keeping her room, but said she would see us, and we went up to her. She was in her dressing-gown, and was sitting quite like an invalid in an armchair, but she got up and kindly greeted us, and then pointed to seats which had been arranged for us by the fire. "There is a chair for the married lady, and a little stool for you, Caroline." I was struck by the alteration in herself. She was very pale, her voice was weak and low, and there was about her a general appearance of debility and suffering, but I have been told that she had never had much acute pain. She was not equal to the exertion of talking to us, and our visit to the sick-room was a very short one, Aunt Cassandra soon taking us away. I do not suppose we stayed a quarter of an hour, and I never saw Aunt Jane again. It was in May that Jane was persuaded to go with her sister to lodgings in Winchester for the sake of further medical advice, and she never returned to Chawton, though probably that was the last thought that would have occurred to her on leaving it, for she was never inclined to be analytical or valetudinarian, and certainly she was one of the last to affect illness or to become an invalid for fancy. Cassandra cannot have known how soon she was to be bereaved of the dear sister whose life had run in such harmony with her own, and though anxiety must have darkened her heart, Jane's own sanguineness would buoy her with fresh hope, and the weeks the sisters passed together in Winchester must have been singularly peaceful. The house in which Jane stayed still stands. It is in College Street, close to the great archway that marks the entrance to the college precincts. She says of it herself, "Our lodgings are very comfortable. We have a neat little drawing-room with a bow window overlooking Dr. Gable's garden." Here her life and strength slowly ebbed away. Day by day she was longer chained to her sofa from increasing weakness. The elementary medical knowledge of her day was powerless to help her, though her life, humanly speaking, could probably have been prolonged if medical science had then known what it knows now. Day by day, through the bow window overlooking the street, would come the sound of boyish voices, the clatter of boyish feet, and she could see the greenery of the trees in the garden beyond the wall. She had plenty of companionship. Cassandra was ever with her, and Mrs. James Austen helped in the nursing. The slight sharpness arising from unusual penetration, which had sometimes marked Jane's comments in earlier days, had all died down. She said gratefully to her sister-in-law, "You have always been a kind sister to me, Mary." And of her own dear Cassandra she said, "I will only say further that my dearest sister, my tender, watchful, indefatigable nurse, has not been made ill by her exertions. As to what I owe her, and the anxious affection of all my beloved family on this occasion, I can only cry over it and pray God to bless them more and more." And on July 18, when all the trees were at their greenest and the bright sunshine lighted up the walls of the hoary abbey, she passed away. We can add nothing to her sister's account, written in the agony of the first bereavement, to her who was now closest to her heart, her niece, Fanny Knight. "My dearest Fanny, doubly dear to me now, for her dear sake whom we have lost. She did love you most sincerely. Since Tuesday evening when her complaint returned, there was a visible change. She slept more and much more comfortably. Indeed, during the last 48 hours, she was more asleep than awake. Her looks altered and she fell away, but I perceived no material diminution of strength, and though I was then hopeless of her recovery, I had no suspicion how rapidly my loss was approaching. I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never can have been surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I had lost a part of myself. She felt herself to be dying about half an hour before she became tranquil and apparently unconscious. During that half hour was her struggle, poor soul. She said she could not tell us what she suffered, though she complained of little fixed pain. When I asked her if there was anything she wanted, her answer was that she wanted nothing but death, and some of her words were, "God grant me patience, pray for me, oh pray for me." Her voice was affected, but as long as she spoke she was intelligible. I hope I do not break your heart, my dearest Fanny, by these particulars. I mean to afford you gratification while I am relieving my own feelings. I could not write so to anybody else. On Thursday, when the clock struck 6, she was talking quietly to me. I cannot say how soon afterwards she was seized again with faintness, which was followed by the sufferings which she could not describe. But Mr. Lyford, who had been sent for, had applied something to give her ease, and she was in a state of quiet insensibility by 7 o'clock at the latest. From that time till 4:30, when she ceased to breathe, she scarcely moved a limb, so that we have every reason to think, with gratitude to the Almighty, that her sufferings were over. A slight motion of the head with every breath remained till almost the last. I sat close to her, with a pillow in my lap to assist in supporting her head, which was almost off the bed, for 6 hours. Fatigue made me then resign my place to Mrs. J.A. for 2 hours and a half, when I took it again, and in about an hour more she breathed her last. There was nothing convulsed which gave the idea of pain in her look. On the contrary, but for the continual motion of the head, she gave one the idea of a beautiful statue, and even now, in her coffin, there is such a sweet, serene air over her countenance as is quite pleasant to contemplate. And later on, after the funeral, she wrote again, "Thursday was not so dreadful a day to me as you imagined. Everything was conducted with the greatest tranquillity, and but that I was determined that I would see the last, and therefore was upon the listen, I should not have known when they left the house. I watched the little mournful procession the length of the street, and when it turned from my sight, I had lost her forever. Even then I was not overpowered, nor so much agitated as I am now in writing of it. Never was a human being more sincerely mourned by those who attended her remains than was this dear creature. May the sorrow with which she is parted with on earth be a prognostic of the joy with which she is hailed in heaven. Oh, if I may one day be reunited with her there." Cassandra herself survived for 28 years, and spent her last days in the cottage at Chawton, endeared to her by recollections of her mother and beloved sister. Jane's resting place in the cathedral is almost opposite the tomb of the founder, William of Wykeham. A large black slab of marble let into the pavement marks the spot. It bears an inscription including the following words: "The benevolence of her heart, the sweetness of her temper, and the extraordinary endowments of her mind obtained the regard of all who knew her, and the warmest love of her immediate connections." Subsequently, her nephew Mr. Austen inserted a brass on the wall near, with an inscription which runs as follows: "Jane Austen, known to many by her writing, endeared to her family by the varied charms of her character, and ennobled by Christian faith and piety, was born at Steventon in the county of Hampshire, December 16, 1775, and buried in this cathedral, July 24, 1817. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness." In 1900 a memorial window was inserted as the result of a public subscription. It was designed and executed by C.E. Kemp. In the head of the window is a figure of St. Augustine, whose name in its abbreviated form is St. Austin. In the center of the upper row of lights is David with his harp. Below his figure in Latin are the words, "Remember in the Lord Jane Austen, who died July 18, A.D. 1817. In the center of the bottom row is the figure of St. John, and the remaining figures are those of the sons of Korah, carrying scrolls, with sentences in Latin indicative of the religious side of Jane Austen's character, namely, "Come ye children, hearken unto me, I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Them that are meek shall he guide in judgment, and such as are gentle, them he shall teach his way. The mouth shall speak of wisdom, and the heart shall muse on understanding. My mouth shall daily speak of thy righteousness and thy salvation." That Jane was so deeply and dearly loved by her own people speaks much for her worth. She and Cassandra, especially Cassandra, were very reticent in their expression of feeling, but seldom has heart been knit to heart as were theirs. The love of sisters has not often formed the theme of song or romance. We hear of a mother's love for her son, of a brother for a brother. But the love of sisters is, when it exists in perfection, as strong as these, as pure in its spring, and more full of feeling. Sisters whose hearts are open to one another, who have shared the same experiences, look on the world from a similar standpoint, and the breaking of such ties is severe agony. At only 41, Jane had passed away still in the highest maturity of her powers, leaving behind her but 6 completed books, all short, but each one perfect in itself. This is what will be said of her. She did what she attempted to do perfectly. The books are all instinct with the same qualities, the precision of word and phrase, the genius for knowing what to select and what to leave unsaid, but not one is repetition of another. In the whole gallery of characters, each one is distinct. She was a real artist. Her work lay apart from and outside of herself. We do not find a picture of herself under different names playing heroine in different sets of circumstances. Each heroine stands by herself, and in her women's portraits she reaches her high-water mark. Elizabeth Bennet, Emma Woodhouse, Fanny Price, Anne Elliot, Catherine Morland, Eleanor Dashwood. We know each one is a friend, and each one is completely differentiated. So brilliant, so perfect, so stamped with its own individuality is each of the books, that one wonders what she could possibly have produced next to take rank with its forerunners. Within so small a compass, with such a narrow stage on which to set the dramatis personae, how did she manage to make so great a variety? It is in keeping with her character and work that there should be no decline, no falling off, that all should be good. It is true that some of the novels are preferred by one, some by another. Some are stronger in one point, some in another, but neither decay nor improvement can justly be found between first and last. This is genius. Genius cannot grow, nor can it be cultivated. It is there, and its work is done without effort and without labor. If Jane had not died at so early an age, her life would not have seemed so complete, so rounded as it did. Her dying in the full plenitude and maturity of her power is in keeping with the level of excellence of her work. Her life had been a happy one, free from mind worries, free from great sorrows. Her affections had wide play, her tastes full development. She was happy in the love of one very near and dear, and if she missed great ecstasies, she at least had no hideous sorrows to endure in the sin or vice of those near to her. Her one great sorrow was perhaps the death of her father, but he was not young, and in the natural course of events his death cannot be called unexpected. Sunny, well occupied, surrounded with the refinements that a sensitive mind appreciates, she lived out a life on a high, uniform level. Her books supplied a motive and mainspring that otherwise might have been felt to be lacking by one so energetic. If, as has been said, happiness on earth demands someone to love, something to do, and something to hope for, she had all these, and much more. End of chapter 19. End of Jane Austen and Her Times by Geraldine Edith MITTON.